They said the cowboy was too hard to love, scarred, cursed, and blamed for a tragedy that shattered Redemption Creek. But when schoolteacher Clara Bennett saw him bleeding in the dust, she made a choice that would change everything. This is the story of a woman who dared to kiss the scars no one else would touch, and the man who learned that even the most broken hearts can heal. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bullet found Luke Kerrigan at high noon on a Tuesday, which seemed fitting for a man who'd been dying by inches for the past 3 years anyway. Clara Bennett heard the shot from inside McCready's general store, where she'd been examining bolts of calico fabric and trying to decide if the green would be too bold for a schoolteacher's dress. The crack of gunfire split the autumn air like lightning, and she dropped the fabric without thinking, her hands already reaching for the medical bag she'd carried since Gettysburg, a habit she couldn't break, even though the war had been over for more than a decade. She pushed through the store's door and onto the wooden sidewalk, her heart already hammering with the old familiar rhythm of crisis. Other townsfolk were emerging too, but they moved slowly, cautiously, as if violence was something to be observed rather than interrupted. Clara didn't have that luxury. Her father had been a battlefield surgeon, and she'd spent 2 years of her youth carrying water and bandages through fields of screaming men. Death didn't frighten her. Indifference did. The cowboy lay in the middle of Main Street, his horse dancing nervously a few feet away, reins dragging in the dust. Even from 20 yards, Clara could see the blood spreading across his left shoulder, dark and thick against the faded blue of his shirt. He was trying to rise, one hand pressed to the wound, his face twisted with pain and something else. Fury, maybe, or resignation. "Stay back, miss," someone called from behind her. "That's Luke Kerrigan." The name meant nothing to her. She'd only arrived in Redemption Creek 3 days ago, stepping off the stage with a trunk of books and a teaching certificate from the Colorado Territorial Education Board. The town needed a school teacher. Clara needed a fresh start. It had seemed like Providence. She gathered her skirts and stepped into the street. "Miss Bennett?" This time it was Mrs. Halloran, the minister's wife, her voice sharp with warning. "You don't understand. That man is—" But Clara was already moving, her button-up boots kicking up small clouds of dust as she crossed the distance between propriety and action. She could feel eyes on her back, could sense the collective intake of breath from the good people of Redemption Creek, but she'd stopped caring about scandals somewhere between Antietam and Chancellorsville. The cowboy heard her coming. His head jerked up, and Clara got her first clear look at him. The left side of his face was a landscape of old violence. Scar tissue that pulled his eyes slightly downward, twisted the corner of his mouth, ran down his neck, and disappeared beneath his collar. The scarring was old, long-healed, but angry-looking, the kind of wounds that spoke of fire or explosion. His right side was untouched, almost beautiful in contrast. Strong jaw, high cheekbone, eyes the color of storm clouds. Those eyes fixed on her now with an intensity that should have stopped her mid-stride. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough, abraded, like something dragged over gravel. "Leave me." Clara knelt in the dust beside him, already opening her medical bag. "Not a chance. I'm not worth saving." He said it flatly, as if stating a proven fact. "Then you'll have to live with my bad judgment." Her hands were steady as she peeled his fingers away from the wound. The bullet had gone clean through the meat of his shoulder. Messy, but not fatal if she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. "What's your name?" "You'll regret this." But he didn't pull away. "I've regretted plenty in my life. One more won't kill me." She tore a strip from her petticoat. Mrs. Halloran would be scandalized, but petticoats were replaceable and this man's life wasn't, and pressed it firmly against the entry wound. He hissed in pain but held still. "Name?" "Luke." A pause. "Luke Kerrigan." "Well, Luke Kerrigan, I'm Clara Bennett, and I'm going to need you to put pressure here while I check the exit wound." She guided his right hand to replace hers, then shifted to examine his back. The bullet had punched through cleanly, which was lucky. She'd seen too many men die from lead fragments left inside. "You're the new schoolteacher." It wasn't a question. "Guilty." "You won't be. Not after this." His words were coming slower now, shock setting in. They'll run you out. Don't let them see you touching me. Clara ignored him, working quickly to create a pressure bandage with the remains of her petticoat and a clean cloth from her bag. The bleeding was slowing already. He'd lost blood, but not enough to be critical. Who shot you? Does it matter? It might. One of Blackstone's men. His jaw clenched. Henry Blackstone owns half this territory. The other half he's working on stealing. She tied off the bandage, perhaps tighter than strictly necessary. And which half do you own? Something that might have been a laugh escaped him. None of it, not anymore. Just some worthless ranch land and a name everyone wishes they could forget. Around them, Clara became aware that the street was filling with people, not helping, just watching. She felt their judgment like pressure against her skin, heavy and expectant. A man in a sheriff's badge stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, arms crossed, making no move to investigate the shooting. Another man, well-dressed, with silver at his temples and a walking stick that looked more decorative than functional, watched from the hotel porch with an expression of cool satisfaction. "Can you ride?" Clara asked quietly. "I can do whatever I need to do." "Then let's get you on that horse before someone decides to finish what they started." She stood, offering him her hand. Luke stared at it for a long moment, as if she'd offered him something precious and incomprehensible. Then slowly he reached up and let her help him to his feet. He swayed once, steadied, and Clara found herself pressed against his right side, supporting more of his weight than she'd expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered despite the lean hardness of someone who worked for every meal. This close, she could smell leather and sage and something metallic, blood and gunpowder. "You're a fool," he said, but there was no heat in it. "So I've been told." His horse had wandered closer, sensing its master's need. Clara helped Luke get his good hand on the saddle horn, then watched as he pulled himself up with a grimace of pain that he tried and failed to hide. Once mounted, he looked down at her, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. "Where do you live?" she asked. 6 miles east, Canyon Creek Ranch." "I'm coming with you." "No." Definitive. Final. "That wound needs proper cleaning and stitching, and you're going to need your temperature monitored for the next 24 hours. Infection kills more men than bullets." She kept her voice matter-of-fact, professional. "You can argue with me, or you can start riding before you pass out and fall off that horse." Luke opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head slowly. "You really are a fool. Then we'll be fools together. Wait here." She turned back toward the general store, acutely aware of the silence that had fallen over Main Street. Every eye was on her, every ear straining to hear their conversation. Mrs. Halloran intercepted her before she reached the sidewalk. "Miss Bennett, Clara." The older woman's face was tight with concern. "You don't know what you're doing. That man has a bullet wound that needs tending." Clara kept her voice level, polite. "And I'm a nurse before I'm a school teacher. He's dangerous. He's bleeding. 3 years ago, there was a mine collapse. 15 men died. Luke Kerrigan was the shift foreman." Mrs. Halloran's words came out in a rush, urgent and pleading. "He was also in love with Catherine Blackstone, Henry Blackstone's daughter. They say he started the collapse when Henry forbade the match. They say he murdered those men out of spite." Clara absorbed this, filing it away for later consideration. "And was he convicted?" "Well, no. There wasn't enough evidence, but everyone knows what they've been told." Clara moved past her, back into the general store. Mr. McCready stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron nervously. "Miss Bennett, I really must advise, I need to purchase supplies." She pulled coins from her reticule. "Carbolic acid, clean linen bandages, laudanum if you have it, and a bottle of whiskey. Also, I need someone to deliver my trunk to Canyon Creek Ranch." The store owner's face went pale. "Canyon Creek? Miss Bennett, you cannot possibly—" "I can and I will. Now, are you going to sell me these supplies, or shall I take my business elsewhere?" It was a hollow threat. McCready's was the only general store in town, but it worked. With shaking hands, he assembled her order while the other customers backed away as if she carried plague. Clara paid, gathered her purchases into a canvas sack, and walked back out into the bright autumn sunshine. Luke was still mounted, still upright, though he'd gone gray around the edges. When he saw her with the supplies, something complicated crossed his scarred face. "Last chance to save yourself," he said. Clara tied the canvas sack to his saddle, then looked around for a way to mount up. Her own horse and buggy were at the boarding house 3 blocks away. Luke followed her gaze, understood, and held out his right hand. "You'll ride with me," he said. But Clara Bennett, the use of her given name sent an unexpected jolt through her. "Don't say I didn't warn you." She took his hand, placed her foot in the stirrup, and let him pull her up behind the saddle. It was improper. It was scandalous. It was necessary. "Warning noted," she said, and wrapped her arms carefully around his waist, avoiding the wounded shoulder. Luke made a sound that might have been pain or laughter, clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward at a gentle walk. As they made their way down Main Street toward the edge of town, Clara felt every stare, every whisper, every judgment falling on her shoulders like stones. On the hotel porch, the silver-haired man with the walking stick smiled. The ride to Canyon Creek Ranch took nearly 2 hours at the careful pace Luke maintained. Clara held on, trying not to jostle his wounded shoulder, watching the landscape transform as they left the town behind. Redemption Creek sat in a high valley, surrounded by pine-covered mountains that blazed with autumn gold. The main street gave way to scattered homesteads, which gave way to open rangeland. The air smelled of sage and coming snow. Winter would arrive early this year, Clara thought. She could feel it in the sharp edge of the wind. Luke didn't speak, and Clara didn't force conversation. She could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself rigid against the pain. Every few minutes, she checked the bandage at his shoulder. Still holding, no fresh blood seeping through. They followed a creek, Canyon Creek presumably, that cut through red rock formations and stands of aspen. The water ran clear and fast, speaking of mountain springs and pure snowmelt, good water, valuable water, especially this far west where drought could break a man faster than any bullet. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Luke turned the horse off the main trail and up a narrow track that climbed toward a box canyon. Clara caught her breath at the view. The canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, protected on 3 sides by red cliffs that glowed like fire in the late afternoon light. A cabin sat in the center, built from logs and stone, with a barn and corral off to one side. It was small but solid, the kind of place built to last. And it was completely isolated. "You live here alone?" Clara asked. "Seems safer that way. For everyone." Luke dismounted slowly, moving like an old man, and Clara slid down after him. She grabbed the canvas sack of supplies and followed him toward the cabin. He didn't lock the door. Out here, who would steal from the cursed man of Redemption Creek? The interior was spare but clean. One room with a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, shelves lined with books that surprised her. Clara caught titles as she passed: Marcus Aurelius, Walt Whitman, a worn copy of Don Quixote. The man who lived here was educated, thoughtful, not the monster the town had described. "Sit," she ordered, pulling out one of the chairs. "Let me see that shoulder in proper light." Luke obeyed, lowering himself into the chair with a grimace. Clara built up the fire first. The cabin was already growing cold, then lit 2 oil lamps and brought them close. She washed her hands in water from the pump by the door, then carefully began removing the makeshift bandage. The wound had stopped bleeding but looked angry, the edges already showing signs of inflammation. Clara cleaned it thoroughly with carbolic acid, ignoring Luke's sharp intake of breath. Then she threaded a needle from her medical kit and began to stitch. "You've done this before," Luke said through gritted teeth. "Too many times to count." Clara worked with steady precision, drawing the torn flesh together. "I spent 2 years at field hospitals during the war. My father was a surgeon. He taught me everything he knew before typhoid took him in '63. I'm sorry." "Don't be. He died doing what he loved." She tied off the first stitch, started the second. "What about you? How did you get those scars on your face?" Luke was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Mine explosion. 4 years ago. I was foreman at the Silver Bell mine, one of Blackstone's operations. We'd been finding pockets of methane gas for weeks, but Blackstone pushed us to maintain production, said we were being cowards. His voice went flat, emotionless. One afternoon, someone's lantern sparked the gas. The whole tunnel lit up like the fires of hell. Clara's hands never stopped moving, but she listened intently. I was near the entrance, got caught in the blast but was blown clear. 15 men behind me weren't so lucky. His hand clenched on the table. I should have shut down the mine, should have refused to work. Instead, I let Blackstone intimidate me, and 15 families lost fathers, brothers, sons. That doesn't make it your fault, doesn't it? Luke's storm gray eyes found hers. I knew it was dangerous. I did it anyway. Clara finished the last stitch and bandaged the wound properly with clean linen. Then she moved around to face him directly, pulling up the second chair. Henry Blackstone owns this town, doesn't he? Controls the sheriff, the judge, probably the newspaper too. He owns everything that matters. And yet you weren't convicted of any crime. Why? Because even Blackstone couldn't manufacture enough evidence. But he didn't need a conviction. The rumors were enough. Luke's voice was bitter. The cursed foreman who killed 15 men. The scarred monster who tried to steal the princess. Catherine Blackstone. His expression shuddered. That was a lifetime ago. Clara stood and began organizing her supplies, giving him space. You need to drink this. She mixed a small amount of laudanum with water. It'll help with the pain and let you sleep. Tomorrow, I'll change the dressing and check for infection. Tomorrow you'll be gone. Actually, I'll be right here. She handed him the glass. That wound needs monitoring, and you need someone to cook for you while you heal. I'll sleep in the barn. No. Luke set the glass down untouched. I appreciate what you did today, Clara Bennett, more than you know. But you need to leave at first light. Go back to town, tell them you made a mistake, that you were just being a good Samaritan. Maybe they'll forgive you. I don't need their forgiveness. Yes, you do. You're a school teacher. Those children need you. Their parents need to trust you. He stood, unsteady but determined. I'm not worth sacrificing your whole future. Clara faced him, this tall, scarred man who'd been shot in the street and left to bleed, who'd been blamed for tragedy and exiled by fear, who'd somehow maintained his dignity through it all. She thought of the books on his shelves, the way he'd tried to warn her away, even while accepting her help, the pain in his eyes when he spoke of those 15 dead miners. Mr. Kerrigan, she said softly. Luke, the war taught me something important. It taught me that sometimes the difference between a good person and a bad person is just who's telling the story. I don't know what really happened in that mine, but I know what I saw today. A man shot in the street while the sheriff watched, while the whole town stood by and did nothing. And I know that if saving your life costs me my teaching position, then Redemption Creek doesn't deserve me anyway. Luke stared at her. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Why can't I be both? She picked up the laudanum again and pressed it into his hand. Now drink this and get some sleep. Doctor's orders. This time he obeyed, draining the glass in one swallow. Clara watched the tension slowly leave his shoulders as the medicine took effect. She guided him to the bed, helped him ease down onto it without reopening the wound. There's a bedroll in the chest, he said, words slurring slightly. You're not sleeping in the barn. We'll discuss it in the morning. Stubborn. Practical. She pulled a blanket over him. Rest now. Luke's eyes were already drifting closed, but just before sleep claimed him, he said something so quietly Clara almost missed it. Thank you. She watched him for a moment, this man the town called a monster, now vulnerable in drug-induced sleep. The scars on his face looked less angry in the firelight, more like a map of survival. She thought about what Mrs. Halloran had said, that he was dangerous, that everyone knew what he'd done. But Clara had learned not to trust everyone knows. Everyone knew the Union would win the war in 6 months. Everyone knew women couldn't do battlefield medicine. Everyone knew 1,000 things that turned out to be lies or half-truths or convenient stories. She found the bedroll in the chest, along with blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. She spread them out near the fireplace, added more wood to keep the cabin warm through the night, and finally allowed herself to sit down. Only then did the full weight of what she'd done settle on her shoulders. She'd arrived in Redemption Creek 3 days ago with such hope, a new position, a new start, a chance to build something meaningful. Now she'd spent those 3 days meeting with parents, touring the one-room schoolhouse, preparing lesson plans for students she might never teach. Because there was no question in her mind. After today, after riding out of town with Luke Kerrigan, after spending the night at his ranch, her reputation was in tatters. Even if nothing improper happened, and nothing would, the appearance was damning. But what was the alternative? Leave him to die in the street? Let infection take him because helping him wasn't respectable? No. Clara had held too many dying men in field hospitals, had watched too much suffering that could have been prevented if someone, anyone, had just been willing to help. She'd promised herself after the war that she would never again let propriety stand between her and doing what was right, even if it cost her everything. She lay down on the bedroll, pulled the blankets up, and watched the fire dance against the log walls. Through the window, stars were emerging in the darkening sky, bright and cold and infinitely distant. Somewhere in town, people were probably talking about her, spinning stories, building the scaffold of her downfall. Let them talk. Tomorrow she would deal with the consequences. Tonight, she would sleep with a clear conscience, knowing that Luke Kerrigan was alive because she'd chosen courage over comfort. And if that made her a fool, then she'd wear the title proudly. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving quietly around the cabin. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was and why. Gray pre-dawn light filtered through the windows. The fire had burned down to embers. Luke stood at the stove, one-handed and clumsy, trying to make coffee. He'd put on a clean shirt, brown flannel that hung loose on his frame, but hadn't managed to button it. The bandage on his shoulder showed no signs of bleeding through, which was a good sign. "You should still be in bed," Clara said, standing and folding the blankets. He turned, looking embarrassed to be caught. "I've been shot before. I know my limits." "Have you been stitched up by a bossy schoolteacher before?" That almost got a smile from him. Almost. "Can't say that I have." "Then you don't know your limits with me involved." She took over at the stove, nudging him toward the table. "Sit. Let me check your wound and then I'll make breakfast." "Clara, that's Miss Bennet to you until I say otherwise," she said primly, though her eyes sparkled with humor. "Now, sit down before you tear those stitches." Luke obeyed, and Clara carefully unwrapped the bandage. The wound looked better than she'd dared hope. Edges knitting together cleanly, no signs of infection yet. She cleaned it again with carbolic acid, applied a salve she'd mixed from herbs in her kit, and rebandaged it with practiced efficiency. "You'll live," she pronounced, "though you need to rest that arm for at least a week. No heavy work, no riding unless necessary." "I have cattle to tend." "Then they'll have to tend themselves for a few days." She moved back to the stove and began actually making coffee, along with pancakes from flour and eggs she found in the larder. "Or you'll tear these stitches, the wound will reopen, infection will set in, and you'll die. Your choice." Luke watched her work with an expression somewhere between amusement and bewilderment. "You're very matter-of-fact about death." "I've seen enough of it to respect it, not fear it." Clara flipped the pancakes with easy competence. "But I've also seen enough unnecessary death to be very irritated when people don't follow medical advice." "Noted." They ate in companionable silence as the sun rose, painting the canyon walls with shades of gold and rose. Clara had to admit the coffee was terrible, so she'd never been much of a cook despite her other skills, but Luke drank it without complaint. "You should head back to town this morning," he said finally. "I can manage from here." Clara had been expecting this. She set down her fork and met his gaze directly. "I need to tell you something about myself, Luke. Something that might help you understand why I'm so stubborn about this." He waited, gray eyes steady on hers. "During the war, I fell in love with a soldier. His name was Thomas Harper. He was a lieutenant, wounded at Stones River." The words came easier than she expected. "I nursed him back to health over 3 months. We planned to marry when the war ended. My father approved. Everyone thought we made a perfect couple." Clara paused, remembering. "Then Thomas returned to his unit. 6 weeks later, he was killed at Chickamauga. I got a letter from his colonel telling me he died bravely, charging into enemy fire." "I'm sorry," Luke said quietly. "So was I," for a long time. Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. But then I received another letter from Thomas's sergeant. He told me the truth. Thomas hadn't charged anything. He'd been shot by one of his own men, a private from Kentucky who'd been drinking and got into an argument about the war. It wasn't heroic. It was stupid and pointless and completely avoidable. She looked up at Luke. The army covered it up because they didn't want to damage morale. They turned a meaningless death into a noble sacrifice. And I realized that's what people do. They turn complicated truth into simple stories because simple stories are easier to live with. So you think the mine explosion was covered up? I think 15 men died, and someone had to be blamed, and you were convenient. Clara stood and began clearing the dishes. I think Henry Blackstone needed a scapegoat to avoid taking responsibility for unsafe working conditions. And I think an entire town decided to believe the simple story. Cursed foreman, forbidden love, revenge, instead of asking hard questions about their most powerful citizen. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You can't know that for certain." "No, but I can choose which story I believe until I know for certain." She pumped water into the basin and started washing dishes. "And I choose to believe that you're a man who made the best decisions he could with the information he had, in a situation controlled by someone more powerful and more ruthless than you. Even if you're wrong, even if I really am responsible." Clara turned to face him. "If I'm wrong, then spending a week nursing you back to health is the least penance you're owed before facing whatever judgment awaits. And if I'm right, then someone in this godforsaken territory needs to stand with you and say that you deserve better than being shot in the street and left to die." Luke stood slowly, crossed to where she stood at the basin. This close, she could see the scars in detail, the way they twisted the skin, pulled at the corner of his eye. They should have been ugly. Instead, Clara found them beautiful in a strange way, like the rings in a tree that showed how it had survived lightning and wind and drought. "You really believe that," he said, not quite a question. "I really do." His hand lifted, hesitated, then very gently touched her cheek. His palm was calloused, warm. "They're going to destroy you for this." "Then I'll be destroyed." Clara didn't pull away. "But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." For a moment they stood there in the morning light, connected by truth and touch, and something neither of them was ready to name. Then Luke stepped back, letting his hand fall. "1 week," he said. "You can stay 1 week to make sure the wound heals clean. Then you go back to town and you fight for that teaching position, and you never mention my name again except to curse it. Understood?" "I'll stay as long as necessary," Clara countered. "And I won't curse any name I don't mean to curse." "Stubborn," he said again, but this time there was warmth in it. "Practical," she replied, smiling. Outside, a horse whinnied. Both of them froze. Luke moved to the window, looked out, and his expression went hard. "Company," he said, "and not the friendly kind." Clara joined him at the window. 3 riders were approaching up the canyon trail, men in dark suits, riding horses too fine for ranch work. Even from a distance, she could see the arrogance in their posture. "Blackstone's men?" she asked. "Probably." Luke reached for the rifle hanging above the fireplace, then winced as his wounded shoulder protested. "You need to hide. The barn, the root cellar, anywhere." "I'll do no such thing." Clara's voice was steel. "I'm not hiding from anyone." "Clara." "Miss Bennett," she corrected, smoothing her skirts. "And I'm about to give these gentlemen a lesson in manners." Before Luke could stop her, she walked to the door and opened it, stepping out onto the small porch with her chin high and her hands folded calmly in front of her. The morning sun lit her from behind, turning her simple brown dress into something almost regal. The 3 riders pulled up 10 feet from the cabin. The lead man was heavy-set, with a badge on his vest that proclaimed him a deputy. The other 2 were clearly hired guns, all swagger and cold eyes. "Miss Bennett," the deputy said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm Deputy Marshal Wayne. We're here on official business." "Official business that requires 3 armed men?" Clara kept her voice pleasant, conversational. "How exciting." Wayne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackstone sent us to check on your welfare, ma'am. The town's concerned about you staying out here with, well..." His gaze flicked to Luke, who'd emerged to stand behind Clara, rifle cradled in his good arm. With certain dangerous individuals. How thoughtful of Mr. Blackstone to be concerned. Clara's tone could have frozen fire. Please assure him that I'm quite well and in no danger whatsoever. See, that's the thing, ma'am. Wayne leaned forward in his saddle. It doesn't look proper. A respectable schoolteacher spending the night alone with a man of Luke Kerrigan's reputation. Folks might get the wrong idea. The only wrong idea, Clara said clearly, is that my medical care of a wounded man is anyone's business but my own and his. Mr. Blackstone's also concerned about that shooting yesterday. Wayne's hand rested casually near his pistol. Seems there might be a warrant coming down for disturbing the peace. We might need to bring Luke in for questioning. Luke started to speak, but Clara cut him off. Deputy Marshal Wayne, is it? Tell me, where exactly did you earn that badge? Because I'm familiar with territorial law, and I know that deputy marshals are appointed by the U.S. Marshal's Office in Denver, not by local land barons. Wayne's face flushed. I'm a duly appointed. You're a hired thug with a piece of tin, Clara interrupted. And this warrant you mentioned? I'd love to see it, because if you're planning to arrest a man for being shot while riding peacefully on a public road, I'll make sure every newspaper in the territory knows about it. My father was friends with the editor of the Rocky Mountain News. I'm sure he'd find this fascinating. It was a bluff. Her father had been dead for more than a decade, and she had no such connections. But her voice rang with absolute conviction, with the authority of someone who'd stared down death in battlefield hospitals and wasn't about to be intimidated by 3 men on horses. Wayne's hand twitched toward his gun. Behind Clara, she heard Luke shift, raising the rifle slightly. The 2 hired guns tensed, reading the situation. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Wayne forced a laugh and leaned back. No need for threats, Miss Bennett. We're just doing our job, checking on a concerned citizen. Consider me checked on. Now, unless you have legitimate business, we'll be going. Wayne gathered his reins. But Miss Bennett? Mr. Blackstone's a powerful man in this territory. It'd be a shame if the school board decided they couldn't employ a teacher with questionable judgment. It would indeed be a shame, Clara agreed. Almost as shameful as a powerful man sending armed thugs to threaten a wounded man and the woman caring for him. I wonder what the territorial governor would make of that. Wayne's eyes narrowed. Then he spurred his horse around, the other 2 following. They rode down the canyon trail without looking back, dust rising in their wake. Clara stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. Luke touched her shoulder gently. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen. Both, Clara said, surprised to find herself laughing. Definitely both. But as they went back inside the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just declared war on Henry Blackstone. And in Redemption Creek, that was a war no one had ever won. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Clara tended Luke's wound each morning and evening, watching with professional satisfaction as it healed cleanly. Between treatments, she cooked meals that were barely edible. Her skills with a rifle far exceeded her skills with a skillet, and Luke tolerated her burnt biscuits and oversalted stew with a grace that bordered on heroic. They talked, not about the mine explosion or Catherine Blackstone or the shooting. Instead, they talked about books. Luke had read widely during his isolation, and Clara found herself debating the merits of Whitman versus Dickinson while kneading bread dough into submission. They talked about the war. Luke had served with the Colorado Volunteers and discovered they'd been in Tennessee at the same time, on the same blood-soaked fields, though they'd never crossed paths. I remember the nurses, Luke said one afternoon as Clara changed his bandage. You were the only thing standing between us and hell. Half the men who survived did so because someone like you refused to let them die. The other half survived because of men like you who refused to give up. Clara tied off the fresh bandage. Courage comes in different forms. On the 4th morning, Clara woke to find Luke already up, standing at the window with his coffee. The tension in his shoulders told her something was wrong before he spoke. "Riders coming," he said. 8, maybe 10, moving fast. Clara joined him at the window, her heart sinking. The group coming up the canyon trail wasn't subtle. They rode in formation, purposeful and aggressive. Even from a distance, she could see rifles. "That's more than a warning party," Luke said quietly. He reached for his rifle with his good hand, checked the load with practiced efficiency. "You need to leave. Now. Take the back trail through the canyon. It'll bring you out north of town." "I'm not leaving. Clara, this isn't 3 men trying to intimidate you. This is something else." His voice was urgent. "Please, I can handle myself, but not if I'm worried about you." Before Clara could argue, the sound of hoofbeats grew loud enough to hear clearly. She looked out again, and her breath caught. Leading the group was the silver-haired man she'd seen on the hotel porch, Henry Blackstone himself, she was certain. Behind him rode Deputy Wayne and 7 other men, all armed. They stopped in a semicircle before the cabin, blocking any escape route. Blackstone sat his horse with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed even for riding, with eyes that assessed value the way a banker counted gold. Luke stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. "Blackstone, this is private property." "Is it?" Blackstone's voice was cultured, Eastern educated. "I seem to recall this land has water rights attached. Water rights that flow from my property upstream. One might argue that makes it my concern. The territorial surveyor ruled on those rights 3 years ago. The spring that feeds Canyon Creek originates on my land." Luke's voice was level, but Clara could hear the anger beneath it. "You lost that fight." "Did I?" Blackstone smiled. "Surveys can be challenged, especially when new evidence comes to light about the original claim, but that's not why I'm here today." His gaze shifted to the cabin, to where Clara stood visible in the doorway. "I'm here about Miss Bennett." Clara stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself beside Luke. "I can speak for myself, Mr. Blackstone." "Ah, the courageous schoolteacher." Blackstone's smile didn't waver. "Your reputation precedes you, Miss Bennett. Battlefield nurse, educated woman, daughter of the late Dr. Bennett of Philadelphia. Quite impressive credentials." The fact that he'd researched her background in just 4 days sent ice down Clara's spine. This was a man who gathered information the way a spider gathered flies. "What do you want?" she asked directly. "Want? I want what's best for Redemption Creek, which is why I'm here with a generous offer." Blackstone leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "The school board met last night. There was some concern about your recent activities. Spending nights alone with a man of questionable character, defying social conventions, making wild accusations about my deputy. Some felt you might not be suitable for molding young minds." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "And you, of course, encouraged these concerns." "On the contrary, I defended you." Blackstone's tone was reasonable, almost kind. "I told them that you were simply naive, new to the territory, unaware of the dangerous situation you'd stumbled into, that you were acting from compassion, not corruption. And I offered a solution." "Which is?" "Come back to town with me now. Publicly apologize for your poor judgment. Accept a small stipend to find lodging with Mrs. Halloran, where you'll be properly chaperoned. Begin teaching next Monday as planned." Blackstone spread his hands. "All is forgiven. Your future is secure. And if I refuse? Then the school board will meet again tonight and vote to terminate your contract. You'll have no income, no home, no prospects in this territory." His voice hardened just slightly. "Denver and Colorado Springs have already been wired. Any school district that considers hiring you will receive a full report of your activities here. You'll never teach again." The threat hung in the morning air like poison. Clara felt Luke tense beside her, sensed him calculating odds and distances. She touched his arm gently, a warning not to do anything rash. "That's quite a comprehensive threat, Mr. Blackstone," she said calmly. "You must have been very busy these past few days." "I protect my town, Miss Bennett, from all threats." His eyes flicked to Luke, some more obvious than others. "And what about Luke? What's your offer for him?" Blackstone's expression went cold. "Kerrigan has no place in this discussion. He made his choices 3 years ago. Now he lives with the consequences." "The consequences of your lies, you mean?" Clara's voice rang out clear and sharp. "The lies about the mine explosion. The lies about whose negligence killed 15 men. The lies that let you avoid responsibility while destroying an innocent man's life." Several of the mounted men shifted uneasily. Deputy Wayne's hand moved toward his pistol, but Blackstone simply smiled. "Careful, Miss Bennett. Slander is a serious accusation, especially without proof. Proof can be found, records can be examined, witnesses can be questioned again, away from your influence." Clara stepped forward to the edge of the porch. "You're terrified of that, aren't you? Terrified that someone might actually look closely at what happened. That's why you're here. Not to save my reputation, but to control me. To make sure I stop asking questions." "You're hysterical," Blackstone said dismissively. "Wayne, take Miss Bennett into custody, for her own protection." Wayne dismounted, started toward the porch. Luke raised his rifle. "That's far enough." "You gonna shoot a lawman, Kerrigan?" Wayne's hand hovered over his pistol. "That'll just prove what everyone says about you." "He's not a lawman. He's your employee." Luke's voice was ice. "And he takes one more step toward her, I'll prove what everyone should know about you." The tension ratcheted higher. 8 rifles against 1 wounded man and an unarmed woman. The mathematics were brutal. Claire could see it in Luke's eyes. He knew he couldn't win this fight, but he was prepared to try anyway. Prepared to die rather than let them take her. Something fierce and bright bloomed in Claire's chest. No one had ever been willing to die for her. Thomas had loved her, but he died for the Union, for abstract glory. Luke barely knew her, and he was ready to face down 8 guns to keep her safe. She wouldn't let him do it. "Wait!" Clara raised her hand, stopping Wayne mid-step. She looked at Blackstone, her mind racing through possibilities. "You want me to come back to town? To teach your children?" "Our children," Blackstone corrected. "Redemption Creek's children." "Fine, I'll do it." Claire ignored Luke's sharp intake of breath. "But on my conditions." Blackstone raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Aren't I? You need me publicly rehabilitated because if you run me out of town, people will ask why. They'll wonder what I might have said or done to threaten you so badly. Right now, I'm just a naive school teacher who made a mistake. But if you destroy me, I become a martyr." Clara smiled without warmth. Martyrs have a way of making people ask uncomfortable questions. She could see the calculation in Blackstone's eyes, the weighing of risks. She pressed her advantage. "So, here are my terms. I'll return to town and teach, but I choose my own lodging. I won't be imprisoned in Mrs. Halloran's house like a wayward child. And Luke Kerrigan is left alone. No more harassment, no more deputations riding out here, no more convenient attempts on his life. He keeps his land, his water rights, and his peace. And in exchange, I teach your children. I maintain respectability. And I don't go digging into mine safety records or asking uncomfortable questions about explosions." Clara let the weight of that statement settle. "Unless I have reason to." It was a gamble. She was betting that Blackstone valued control over revenge, that he'd rather have her contained and quiet than destroyed and potentially dangerous. She was betting that he was smart enough to recognize a strategic retreat. Blackstone studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, appreciative of a worthy opponent. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Miss Bennett. Very well, you have your terms on one condition of your own. Which is? You sign a contract with the school board, 3 years minimum. If you break it, you forfeit 6 months' salary and any teaching credentials you hold." His smile sharpened. "That keeps you honest and invested in this town's future." 3 years. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of watching every word, of pretending the man she'd saved wasn't being slowly destroyed by lies and isolation. But 3 years was also time. Time to find proof. Time to build alliances. Time to plan. "Done," Clara said. "But I want it witnessed, and I want it to include explicit protection for Luke Kerrigan and his property." "You drive a hard bargain." Blackstone nodded slowly. "Wayne, ride back to town. Have the contract drawn up. We'll sign it at the hotel this afternoon." Wayne looked confused but obeyed, mounting his horse and spurring it toward town. The other men remained, rifles still ready, reminding everyone that this negotiation happened under the shadow of violence. Blackstone turned his attention to Luke. "Kerrigan, you've got yourself a guardian angel. I'd advise not wasting her sacrifice." "It's not a sacrifice," Clara said firmly. "It's a choice. My choice." We'll see how you feel in 3 years. Blackstone gathered his reins. Miss Bennett, I'll expect you in town by sunset. Bring your trunk and your credentials. Mrs. Halloran has been instructed to find you suitable independent lodging, at your expense, of course. Of course. Blackstone and his men rode out, leaving Clara and Luke alone in the sudden silence. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the canyon walls, but Clara felt cold down to her bones. You shouldn't have done that, Luke said quietly. 3 years is a prison sentence. 3 years is an opportunity. Clara turned to face him. He just gave me everything I need, time, access, and a legitimate reason to be in this town. Plus, he showed his hand. He's terrified of what might be uncovered about that mine explosion. He's also got you exactly where he wants you, under his thumb. Does he? Clara smiled grimly. I've spent 3 years nursing men who were supposed to die. I've outlasted siege and disease and the certainty that I'd never see home again. Henry Blackstone thinks he's won because he's forced me into a contract. But contracts work both ways. He's also bound by what he promised me. Luke shook his head slowly. You really don't know what you're up against. Then teach me. Clara reached out and took his hand. Not the wounded side, but his right hand, the one unmarred by scars. I have 3 years in this town. Use me. Tell me what you know about Blackstone, about the mine, about everything that happened. Help me understand what I'm fighting. I don't want you fighting my battles. It's not your battle anymore. It's mine. Clara squeezed his hand. The moment I stepped into that street and refused to let you bleed to death, I made it mine. Now, let me fight it properly. Luke looked down at their joined hands, at her fingers wrapped around his calloused palm. When he looked back up, something had shifted in his expression, resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. You'll need to be careful. Blackstone's reach extends everywhere. The sheriff, the judge, half the merchants in town. He controls credit, supplies, water rights. Cross him openly and you'll find yourself without fuel for winter, without food in the store, without legal recourse when something goes wrong. How did you survive 3 years? I raise cattle, I hunt. I built this cabin with my own hands and I don't owe anyone anything. Luke's jaw tightened, and I accepted that I'd die alone out here, unmourned and unforgiven. That was the price of truth. Truth shouldn't cost that much. But it does. In this territory, truth is expensive and lies are cheap. He pulled his hand gently from hers. You should pack. You'll need to leave soon if you're going to reach town by sunset. Clara wanted to argue, to find words that would break through the resignation in his voice, but she'd already pushed him far enough today. Instead, she nodded and went inside to gather her few belongings. Her trunk had been delivered days ago by a nervous ranch hand who'd left it on the porch and fled. Clara packed quickly, her extra dresses, her books, her medical supplies, everything she'd brought to start her new life in Redemption Creek, a life that had just gotten far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Luke appeared in the doorway as she was closing the trunk. I've saddled the horse. I'll drive you in the buckboard. You're supposed to be resting that shoulder. 3-hour drive won't kill me. His tone left no room for argument. Besides, I want to see this contract before you sign it. Make sure Blackstone doesn't slip anything past you. The drive to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The buckboard rattled over the rough trail, and Clara found herself memorizing landmarks, the twisted pine that marked the halfway point, the red rock formation that looked like a cathedral, the place where Canyon Creek split around a small island thick with willows. She was memorizing the route because she knew, with absolute certainty, that she'd be making this journey again. Despite the contract, despite Blackstone's threats, despite every reasonable argument against it, Clara knew she wasn't done with Luke Kerrigan or Canyon Creek Ranch. As they crested the final rise and Redemption Creek came into view below them, Luke spoke for the first time in an hour. That first day when you came to help me, do you regret it? Clara considered the question seriously. She'd lost her teaching position before she'd even started. She'd been threatened, manipulated, and forced into a contract that bound her to a town controlled by a corrupt tyrant. She'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. No, she said finally. I don't regret it at all. Luke was silent for a moment. Then, neither do I. They rode into town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street. People stopped to stare, The cursed foreman and the scandalous schoolteacher riding together in broad daylight. Clara kept her head high, her spine straight. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She'd survived worse than small-town gossip. The hotel was the finest building in Redemption Creek, 3 stories of painted wood with a wide veranda. Blackstone was waiting on that veranda, along with 3 men Clara didn't recognize, the school board presumably. Deputy Wayne stood to one side, looking smug. Luke helped Clara down from the buckboard, and she felt the weight of every watching eye. He carried her trunk as they climbed the steps to the veranda, and Clara noticed with satisfaction that his shoulder seemed to be healing well. Her stitches were holding. "Miss Bennett," Blackstone gestured to a table where papers were laid out. "Gentlemen, may I introduce our new school teacher. Miss Bennett, this is Samuel Finch, chairman of the school board. Reverend Halloran and Dr. Mitchell." Clara nodded to each man. Finch was elderly, nervous. Halloran had the pinched look of a man constantly disappointed by humanity. Dr. Mitchell, surprisingly, had kind eyes that assessed her with professional interest. "I've reviewed the contract," Luke said before anyone else could speak. He set down Clara's trunk and picked up the papers. "With Miss Bennett's permission?" Clara nodded. Let them see that she had an advisor, that she wasn't alone in this negotiation. Luke read through the contract slowly, his finger tracing each line. Clara watched the men's faces, Finch fidgeting, Halloran disapproving, Mitchell curious. Blackstone simply looked amused, as if Luke's scrutiny was a formality he tolerated rather than a concern. "Section 12, Luke said finally. "It says the teacher can be dismissed for moral turpitude or conduct unbecoming. That's vague enough to drive a wagon through. Needs to be specific." "Those are standard terms," Finch protested weakly. "Make them specific," Luke repeated, his voice hard. "What constitutes grounds for dismissal? Spell it out. Otherwise, this contract isn't worth the paper it's written on." Blackstone's smile thinned. "Very well. Criminal conviction, public intoxication, or abandonment of duties for more than 3 consecutive days without cause. Will that satisfy your legal expertise, Kerrigan?" "It's a start. Now, Clause 15, access to school records and decisions. Miss Bennett should have the right to review any decisions affecting her employment." They went back and forth for another 30 minutes, Luke finding every loophole and potential trap in the contract. Clara watched in fascination as this supposedly uneducated cowboy demonstrated a sharp legal mind. Blackstone's amusement gradually gave way to irritation, but he made the changes, each concession given with ill grace. Finally, Luke set down the papers. "One more thing. The section about Mr. Kerrigan's protection needs to be explicit. No harassment, no trespassing on his property, no interference with his livestock or water rights, and consequences if those terms are violated." "Such as?" Blackstone's voice was ice. "Such as Miss Bennett being released from this contract with full pay for the remainder of the term." Luke met Blackstone's gaze steadily. "If you break your word, she walks away clean." The veranda went very quiet. This wasn't just negotiation anymore, it was challenge. Luke was telling Blackstone that his word mattered, that promises had to be kept, that power didn't exempt him from honor. For a long moment, Clara thought Blackstone would refuse. His face flushed, his knuckles whitened on the head of his walking stick. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Agreed. Draw up the amendment, Finch." The chairman scrambled to add the language to the contract. When it was done, Clara read through everything one more time. It wasn't perfect. Contracts never were. But it was better than she dared hope. Luke had fought for her with the same fierce intensity he'd shown when facing down 8 rifles. She signed her name in careful script, Clara Bennett. The 3 school board members countersigned. Blackstone added his signature last, the flourish of a man who still believed he held all the cards. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Bennett," he said, handing her a copy of the contract. "I'm sure you'll have a long and productive tenure here." "I'm sure I will." Clara folded the contract carefully. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I need to find my lodging and prepare for Monday." "Mrs. Halloran has arranged a room at the boarding house," Reverend Halloran said. 2 blocks south. Blue shutters. She's expecting you." Clara picked up her medical bag, but Luke had already lifted her trunk. "I'll help you get settled," he said. "That won't be necessary," Blackstone interjected smoothly. I'm sure Miss Bennet wants to avoid any further impropriety. I'm sure Miss Bennet can decide for herself what she wants. Clara's voice was sweet poison. And right now, I want help with my trunk. Shall we, Luke? She swept down the veranda steps without waiting for permission, Luke following with her trunk. Behind them, Clara heard Reverend Halloran's scandalized whisper and Blackstone's low, angry response. She didn't care. She'd signed their contract, played by their rules. Now she'd live by her own. The boarding house was respectable but shabby, run by a widow named Mrs. Carson, who had the weary look of someone constantly struggling to make ends meet. The room Clara had been assigned was small but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, a desk by the window. It would do. Luke set down the trunk and looked around the cramped space. It's not much. It's mine. That's enough. Clara opened the window to let in fresh air. From here she could see the mountains in the distance, blue and eternal. Somewhere beyond those peaks was Luke's canyon, his cabin, the place where she'd spent 4 days that had changed everything. I should go, Luke said, before tongues wag any more than they already are. Clara turned to face him. The small room made him seem even larger, made her acutely aware of his presence. The afternoon light caught the scars on his face, and she had the sudden, fierce urge to touch them again, to remind herself they were real, and he was real, and none of this was a fever dream. Thank you, she said instead, for what you did today. The contract would have been a trap without you. I learned a few things during my exile. Reading law books passes the time. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Clara, Miss Bennet, be careful. Blackstone gave in today, but he'll be watching, waiting for you to slip. Let him watch. I'm very good at not slipping. Luke almost smiled at that. I believe you are. But if you need anything, if anything happens that frightens you or makes you feel unsafe, you send word. I might be cursed, but I still remember how to protect people I care about. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should be. People I care about. 4 days of knowing each other, and somehow they'd crossed from strangers to something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but felt real and solid and dangerous. I will, Clara promised. And Luke, don't be a stranger. If you need supplies or your shoulder checked or just someone to argue about Whitman with, you know where to find me. 3 years is a long time to avoid someone in a town this small. Then don't avoid me. Let them talk. We've already given them plenty to whisper about. Might as well give them something real to gossip over. This time Luke did smile, and Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. His smile transformed his face, made the scars seem like art rather than damage. She wanted to see him smile more. She wanted to be the reason for it. You're troubled, Clara Bennet. So I've been told. She walked him to the door. See you Sunday. Sunday? Church. I assume everyone goes to church in Redemption Creek? At his nod, she continued, Then I'll see you there, and we'll sit together. Let Reverend Halloran preach about scandal while we demonstrate exactly how much we care about his opinion. Luke shook his head, but he was still smiling. You really are determined to ruin both our reputations, aren't you? Our reputations are already ruined. Might as well enjoy the fall. After he left, Clara sat on her narrow bed and allowed herself, for the first time since the confrontation at the ranch, to feel the full weight of what she'd done. 3 years. 3 years bound to this town, to these people, to a contract that tied her to a man she barely knew and a cause that might destroy her. But as she unpacked her trunk and arranged her few belongings in the small room, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. She felt purpose. For 3 years after the war, she'd been drifting, teaching in Philadelphia, then Boston, then St. Louis. Good positions, respectable schools, but always moving on before she could put down roots. Always running from the memory of what she'd lost. Now, finally, she'd found something worth staying for. Not just Luke, though he was part of it, but the truth. Justice. The simple, radical act of standing with someone everyone else had abandoned. Her mother would have been horrified. Her Philadelphia friends would have been scandalized. Even Thomas, she thought, might have tried to talk her out of it, to make her see reason, choose safety over risk. But Clara had spent 2 years watching men die. She'd learned that safety was an illusion, and reputation was cold comfort in the grave. She'd learned that the only thing that mattered, in the end, was whether you'd been brave enough to stand for something true. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Dr. Mitchell standing in the hallway, his medical bag in hand. "Miss Bennett, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Dr. Mitchell. Please, come in." He entered hesitantly, his eyes taking in her sparse belongings with the trained observation of someone who noticed details. "I wanted to welcome you officially to Redemption Creek, and to apologize for the circumstances of that welcome." Clara gestured to the desk chair while she sat on the bed. "You have nothing to apologize for, Doctor. You weren't the one making threats." "No, but I sat silent while others did." Mitchell set down his bag with a sigh. "That's cowardice of a different sort. I've practiced medicine in this town for 12 years, Miss Bennett. I've watched Henry Blackstone consolidate power, silence dissent, and ruin anyone who stands against him. And I've done nothing because I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than fighting for truth." "Oh, why are you telling me this?" "Because you did in 4 days what I haven't managed in 12 years. You stood up to him, publicly, without regard for the consequences." Mitchell leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I wanted you to know that not everyone in Redemption Creek is blind or complicit. Some of us simply lack your courage." Clara studied him, the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the hands that had saved lives and set bones and signed death certificates. He was older than Luke, younger than Blackstone, old enough to remember what the town had been before the mine explosion changed everything. "Tell me about the explosion," she said. "What really happened?" Mitchell glanced at the door, lowered his voice. "What happened is that Henry Blackstone cut safety measures to increase profits. The miners complained about methane gas for weeks. Luke Kerrigan documented every complaint, sent reports to the territorial mine inspector. But Blackstone owned the inspector's brother-in-law, so the reports disappeared. Luke said he should have shut down the mine. He tried. Blackstone threatened to have him arrested for destruction of property and loss of wages. Luke was young, 27, 28, and he had no power against a man like Blackstone." Mitchell's voice was bitter. "So he kept the mine running, kept hoping someone with authority would intervene. Then the gas ignited." Clara felt cold. "And Blackstone blamed Luke." "Blamed him, then paid off the territorial investigation. By the time anyone thought to look at the original safety reports, they'd been destroyed." Mitchell met her eyes. 15 men died because Henry Blackstone valued profit over human life. Luke Kerrigan has spent 3 years being called a murderer for the crime of being powerless to stop it. Why hasn't anyone spoken up? Surely some people know the truth. Some do. But Blackstone controls their livelihoods, their credit, their futures. Speak against him, and suddenly your loan comes due, your goods stop arriving at the store. The law finds reasons to harass you." Mitchell stood, moved to the window. "He's turned this whole town into accomplices through silence. We're all guilty, Miss Bennett, every single one of us." Clara thought about this for a moment. "Is that why you're here? To ease your guilt by confessing to me?" "No." Mitchell turned back to her. "I'm here to offer my help. Whatever you need, information, support, medical supplies, you come to me. I can't stand publicly with you, not yet. But I can work behind the scenes, and if you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need allies." "What do you think I'm planning?" "To find proof. To expose Blackstone. To get justice for Luke and those 15 dead miners." Mitchell smiled grimly. "Am I wrong?" Clara thought about the contract she'd just signed, about 3 years in this town, about all the ways this could go wrong. Then she thought about Luke's face when he talked about the men who'd died, about the weight of unearned guilt he'd carried for 3 years. "No," she said, "you're not wrong. Then you'll need to be smart about it. Blackstone's covered his tracks well, but every crime leaves evidence. Mine records, financial documents, witness testimonies. They exist somewhere. The trick is finding them without Blackstone discovering what you're doing." Mitchell picked up his bag. "I'll start asking questions, carefully, and I'll let you know what I find." After he left, Clara sat in the gathering dusk and felt the shape of her new life taking form. She'd come to Redemption Creek to teach children their letters. Instead, she'd stumbled into a war fought with contracts and whispers, with lies and silence, with the slow grinding machinery of power against truth. She should be afraid. But as darkness fell over the town and lights began to glow in windows up and down the street, Clara felt only determination. She'd pulled Luke Kerrigan back from death once. Now she'd pull his name back from the grave of lies that had buried it, even if it took 3 years, even if it cost her everything. Some things she'd learned in the war were worth dying for. Justice was one of them, and something told her that Luke Kerrigan might be another. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of October day that promised snow before the week was out. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, dark blue wool with modest trim, and pinned her hair into a severe bun that screamed respectability. If she was going to scandalize the town by sitting with Luke Kerrigan in church, she'd do it looking like the most proper schoolteacher Colorado Territory had ever seen. She arrived at the white clapboard church 15 minutes early and took a seat in the middle pew on the left side. Prime location, visible to everyone but not so forward as to seem presumptuous. The church filled slowly with families in their Sunday clothes, conversation stopping abruptly when people noticed her. Clara kept her eyes on the simple wooden cross at the front of the sanctuary and pretended not to notice the whispers. Mrs. Halloran swept in with her husband, saw Clara, and her face went through several expressions before settling on pained duty. She crossed to Clara's pew with the air of someone approaching a leper colony. "Miss Bennet, how brave of you to attend this morning." "Why wouldn't I attend, Mrs. Halloran? I'm a faithful churchgoer." Clara smiled pleasantly. "I'm looking forward to your husband's sermon." "Yes." "Well," Mrs. Halloran glanced around at the filling church. "You should know that the Kerrigans used to sit in this pew. Before the incident. Some might find it presumptuous for you to—" "I'll be happy to share the pew with any Kerrigan who wishes to join me." Mrs. Halloran's face went pale. "Miss Bennet, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply sitting in church waiting for the service to begin." Clara kept her voice light, conversational. "Is there a problem?" Before Mrs. Halloran could respond, the church door opened and Luke Kerrigan walked in. The effect was electric. Conversation died completely. Every head turned. Luke stood in the doorway for a moment, dressed in black trousers and a clean white shirt, his hat in his hands. The scars on his face seemed more pronounced in the morning light filtering through the windows. He looked like a man walking into a lion's den with his eyes wide open. His gaze found Clara, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, solidarity, the recognition of two people who'd chosen the hard path and wouldn't turn back. He walked down the center aisle with measured steps, his boots loud on the wooden floor. People drew back as if he carried contagion. "Miss Bennet," he stopped beside her pew. "May I join you?" "I'd be honored, Mr. Kerrigan." Luke slid into the pew beside her, and Clara heard the collective intake of breath from the congregation. Mrs. Halloran made a small sound of distress and hurried back to her own seat. Samuel Finch, the school board chairman, looked like he might faint. Even Henry Blackstone, seated in the front pew with his wife, Clara's first glimpse of the pale, brittle woman, turned to stare with barely concealed fury. "You didn't have to do this," Luke murmured, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "Neither did you." "I haven't been to church in 3 years. Figured it was time I stopped letting them make me feel ashamed for sins I didn't commit." Clara glanced at him sideways. "And here I thought you came just to scandalize the good people of Redemption Creek with me." "That too." The corner of his mouth quirked up slightly. "Two birds, one stone." Reverend Halloran entered from the side door, took his place at the pulpit, and froze when he saw Luke. His prepared sermon, whatever it had been, clearly wasn't designed for this moment. He fumbled with his notes, cleared his throat, and began with a hymn. The congregation sang Amazing Grace with more vigor than harmony, and Clara joined in, her voice clear and strong. Beside her, Luke was silent. She wondered if he'd forgotten how to sing, or simply couldn't bear to after 3 years of isolation. Then Reverend Halloran began to preach, and Clara understood why Mrs. Halloran had looked so pained. "Today I want to speak about the sin of pride," Halloran intoned, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "The pride that makes us think we know better than our betters. The pride that leads us to question the wisdom of those God has placed in authority over us." Clara felt Luke tense beside her. She reached over carefully and placed her hand on the pew between them, not touching him, but close enough that he'd know she was there. The Bible tells us that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. We see this in the story of Lucifer, the angel who thought himself equal to God and was cast down for his arrogance. We see it in our own lives when we question, when we rebel, when we refuse to accept the natural order of things. Several people nodded along with the sermon. Samuel Finch looked relieved, as if a crisis had been averted. Blackstone sat with his arms crossed, satisfaction evident in his posture. And we see it, Halloran continued, warming to his theme, in those who would sow discord in our community, who would question the judgments of good men, who would associate with those rightly shunned by decent society. Such pride is not just foolish, it is dangerous. It threatens the very fabric of our town. Clara had heard enough. She stood up. The sound of her rising echoed through the sudden silence, every eye fixed on her. Reverend Halloran stopped mid-sentence, his mouth open in surprise. "Forgive me, Reverend," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly, "but I have a question about your sermon." "Miss Bennet, this is most irregular. You speak of pride and questioning authority. But didn't Jesus himself question the Pharisees? Didn't he overturn the money changers' tables? Didn't he dine with tax collectors and sinners, despite what the decent society of his day thought?" Halloran's face flushed. That was different. Was it? Because it seems to me that Jesus spent most of his ministry telling people that the natural order they'd accepted was wrong, that the first would be last and the last first, that publicans and prostitutes would enter heaven before the self-righteous. Clara's voice was steady, almost conversational. "So I'm curious, Reverend, when you preach about not questioning authority, which authority do you mean? The authority of powerful men? Or the authority of truth?" The silence in the church was absolute. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Henry Blackstone had turned completely around in his pew, his face dark with anger. His wife had gone even paler, if that was possible, her hands clenched in her lap. "Young woman, you are disrupting a sacred service. I'm asking a theological question. Isn't that what church is for? Learning? Discussion? Or is it just for reinforcing whatever those in power want us to believe?" Luke stood up beside her. "Clara." "It's Miss Bennet," she corrected automatically, then turned to include the whole congregation. "I came to this town to teach, and I've learned that teaching means asking hard questions. It means not accepting easy answers just because they're comfortable. It means standing up for truth even when truth is inconvenient." She looked directly at Blackstone. "Especially when truth is inconvenient." "This is outrageous," Samuel Finch sputtered from his pew. "Miss Bennet, as chairman of the school board, I must insist—" "You must insist on what, Mr. Finch? That I sit quietly while lies are preached from the pulpit? That I pretend not to notice when a sermon is less about God and more about control?" Clara gathered her shawl. "I signed a contract to teach your children. I didn't sign away my conscience or my voice in my life. But standing up for what's right has never been one of them." They walked out into the cold autumn sunshine, leaving chaos behind them. Clara could hear the explosion of voices starting before the church door even closed. She made it to the street before her knees started shaking. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," Luke said. His voice held something that might have been awe. "And I've seen you do a lot of brave, foolish things." I couldn't sit there and listen to that. He was using God to justify lies. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "My father always said that the worst sins are the ones committed in righteousness. You just destroyed any chance you had of being accepted in this town." "I was never going to be accepted. Not really. Not as long as I associated with you." Clara started walking, not sure where she was going, just needing to move. "Besides, I don't want acceptance if it means silence." Luke caught up with her, matched her pace. They walked past the hotel, past the general store, toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. Neither spoke until they were well away from curious ears. "You can't keep doing this," Luke said finally, "fighting my battles, sacrificing your position for my sake." "It's not sacrifice if I choose it freely." "Clara." He stopped walking, caught her arm gently. You signed a 3-year contract that was supposed to give you stability, a place to belong. Now you've just alienated half the town and given Blackstone ammunition to use against you. Then I'll deal with the consequences." She pulled her arm free, not angrily but firmly. "Luke, do you know what I did during the war? I held men while they died. I wrote letters to mothers and wives telling them their loved ones were gone. I watched gangrene and cholera and hemorrhaging fever take boys who should have lived to be old men." Her voice was steady but fierce. "And you know what the worst part was? Not the death, not the suffering. It was the waste. Men dying because supplies didn't arrive, because commanders made mistakes, because nobody questioned the orders even when the orders were wrong. I swore when the war ended that I'd never again stay silent when I could speak. Never again watch injustice happen because it was safer to look away." Luke studied her face, and Clara wondered what he saw there. The stubborn school teacher? The battlefield nurse? Or something else entirely, something even she didn't fully understand yet. "You're going to get hurt," he said quietly. "Blackstone doesn't forgive challenges to his authority." "Probably. But I'll heal." She smiled, trying to lighten the moment. "I have an excellent nurse, after all." That got a genuine laugh from him, short but real. "You're impossible." "I'm consistent. There's a difference." They walked further, leaving the town behind entirely. The mountains rose blue and distant, crowned with snow that would reach the valley floor before winter was through. Clara found herself thinking about what 3 years meant in a place like this. 3 seasons of snow. 3 springs of thaw. 3 autumns watching the aspens turn gold. "Tell me about Catherine," she said suddenly. "I've heard the rumors. I want to hear the truth." Luke was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. They'd reached a small grove of cottonwoods by the creek, and he stopped there, looking at the water flowing clear and cold over smooth stones. "Catherine Blackstone was everything this territory promised to be and never was," he said finally. "Beautiful, educated, full of ideals about making something good out here. She came west with her father 5 years ago when he bought the mine. She hated everything he stood for, the greed, the control, the way he treated people like resources to be exploited." He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hands. "We met at a church social, started talking about books. She'd brought a whole library with her from Boston. I was a foreman at her father's mine, trying to keep men safe while her father cut costs. We fell in love despite every reason not to." "What happened?" "Blackstone found out. Forbade the match. Said his daughter wouldn't marry a common laborer, that I was trying to elevate myself beyond my station." Luke threw the stone into the creek with sudden violence. "He threatened to fire me, to blacklist me throughout the territory. Catherine said we should run away together, start over somewhere else. But you didn't. I was young and stupid enough to think I could change his mind. Thought if I proved myself valuable enough, worked hard enough, kept his mind safe and profitable, he'd see I was worthy." Luke's laugh was bitter. "Instead, he used me, pushed the mine past safety limits, knowing I'd take the blame if anything went wrong. And when it did, when the explosion happened, he made sure everyone knew I was the foreman, that I was responsible." "And Catherine?" Luke's expression went distant, pained. "Catherine tried to defend me. Told anyone who'd listened that I'd warned her father about the gas, that I'd tried to shut down the mine. Blackstone had her declared hysterical with grief. She'd lost friends in the explosion too. Within a month, he'd sent her back to Boston, married her off to some banker twice her age. I got one letter from her months later. She said her father had made it clear that any attempt to contact me would result in me being charged with harassment or worse." Clara felt a surge of anger on behalf of this woman she'd never met. "So he separated you and then destroyed your reputation so thoroughly that even if she came back, you'd be too toxic to approach. That about sums it up. Do you still love her?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Luke met Clara's eyes, and she saw something complicated there. Grief, yes, but also something that looked like relief. "I loved who she was, or who I thought she was." He shook his head slowly. "But that was 3 years ago. 3 years of silence, of exile, of learning to live without hope. Love doesn't survive that unchanged. What I feel now is mostly sadness for what might have been. Clara nodded, understanding more than he'd said. She'd felt the same way about Thomas, the ghost of love that faded over time until what remained was memory rather than ache. "Come on," she said, starting back toward town. "We've scandalized them enough for one day, and I need to prepare for tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" "School starts. I have 23 students, ranging from 6 to 14. I'm terrified." She smiled at him. "But at least after this morning, the parents already know I'm not going to teach their children blind obedience." Luke walked her back to the boarding house, both of them aware of the curtains twitching as they passed. At her door, he paused. "Clara, what you did this morning, standing up in church, that took more courage than I've shown in 3 years. You survived 3 years alone. That took a different kind of courage. Surviving isn't the same as living." He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars. "I'd forgotten that until you came along and reminded me." Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Carson appeared in the doorway behind them, her face tight with disapproval. "Miss Bennett, I need to speak with you, privately." Luke tipped his hat. "I'll see you around, Miss Bennett." "Count on it, Mr. Kerrigan." She watched him walk away, his shoulders straight despite the weight of the morning's confrontation. Then she turned to face Mrs. Carson, already knowing what was coming. "I'm afraid I need to ask you to find other lodging," the widow said without preamble. "Several of my other boarders have expressed concerns about your associations. I can't afford to lose their business." Clara had expected this, but it still stung. "How long do I have? End of the week? I'm sorry, Miss Bennett, truly, but I have to think of my livelihood." "I understand." And she did. That was the insidious thing about Blackstone's power. He didn't need to explicitly threaten anyone. The fear alone was enough to make people police each other. Clara spent the afternoon searching for new lodging and finding every door politely but firmly closed. The other boarding house was full. Rooms above the saloon were unsuitable for a school teacher. The few families who took in boarders suddenly had no space available. By sunset, Claire was facing the real possibility of having nowhere to live. She was sitting in her room trying to decide what to do when someone knocked. Dr. Mitchell stood in the hallway, his medical bag in hand as always. "I heard about Mrs. Carson," he said without preamble. "I have a solution, if you're willing to consider it." Clara gestured him inside. "I'm listening." "My wife died 2 years ago. I've been living alone in a house far too large for one person. There's a separate entrance to the upper floor. Used to be servants' quarters back when we could afford servants." Mitchell spoke quickly, as if worried she'd refuse before he finished. "You could have those rooms. Complete privacy, your own space, and it would be completely respectable. I'm old enough to be your father, and the whole town knows I'm still mourning my wife." "Dr. Mitchell, I can't ask you to..." "You're not asking. I'm offering. And honestly, Miss Bennett, I'd welcome the company. The house has been too quiet for too long." He smiled sadly. "Besides, this way I can help you more directly. My study has records going back 15 years, including reports from the Silver Bell mine that might prove very interesting." Clara understood what he was really offering, not just lodging, but alliance, access to information, a safe base from which to operate. "Won't Blackstone retaliate against you?" "He might try, but I'm the only doctor in town, and even Blackstone can't afford to alienate me completely. People get sick, babies get born, bones get broken. They need me more than I need their approval." Mitchell stood. "Think about it tonight. If you're interested, come by tomorrow after school. I'll show you the rooms." After he left, Clara sat by her window and watched the sun set over the mountains. Below her, Redemption Creek settled into evening. Smoke rising from chimneys, lamps being lit, families gathering for supper. A town that looked peaceful on the surface but roiled underneath with secrets and lies and the slow poison of unchecked power. She thought about the morning's confrontation in church, about Luke's story of Catherine, about Dr. Mitchell's careful offer of alliance. She thought about the contract she'd signed and the 3 years stretching ahead of her like a battlefield she'd chosen to walk onto. Monday morning, 23 children would arrive at the schoolhouse expecting her to teach them. Some of their parents would have heard about the church incident. All of them would know about her association with Luke Kerrigan. They'd be watching, judging, waiting to see if she'd falter. Clara smiled grimly at her reflection in the darkening window. Let them watch. She'd spent 2 years being watched by dying men, by exhausted surgeons, by generals who thought women had no place in field hospitals. She'd learned to work under scrutiny, to make every action count, and she'd learned something else, too. She'd learned that real change didn't happen in dramatic moments. It happened slowly, in small acts of defiance, in questions asked, in truths spoken, in the steady, relentless pressure of someone who refused to accept lies as inevitable. Blackstone thought he'd contained her by forcing her into a contract, but contracts worked both ways. For 3 years, she'd have access to this town, to its children, to its secrets. 3 years to slowly, carefully build a case against the man who destroyed Luke's life and killed 15 minors. 3 years was a long time, long enough to change everything. Clara prepared for bed but found herself restless. She lit her lamp and pulled out a journal she'd kept sporadically since the war, a habit from her father, who'd always said that writing clarified thinking. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. First day of teaching tomorrow. 23 students, ages 6 to 14. We'll need to assess their levels quickly. Mathematics seems to be weak across the board based on the entrance tests I saw. Reading varies widely, some quite advanced, others barely literate. But that wasn't what needed recording. She dipped her pen again. The real education begins with questions. Why did the mine explode? What records exist? Who benefits from the lies and who suffers? Dr. Mitchell has offered access to old mine reports. Need to review carefully without drawing attention. Luke Kerrigan, the man they've made into a monster, is actually the most decent person I've met in this town. Scarred, yes. Damaged, certainly. But not broken. There's strength there. Integrity. The kind of man who'd rather die than compromise his principles. She paused, pen hovering over paper. Then she wrote one more line. I think I'm falling in love with him. God help me. Clara closed the journal quickly, as if the words might escape if she let them breathe. She wasn't ready to examine that feeling too closely. There was too much else to focus on. Teaching, investigating, surviving. Romance was a complication she couldn't afford. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was of Luke's face in the church that morning. The way he'd stood when she stood. The quiet strength of his presence beside her. The knowledge that she wasn't alone in this fight. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And somehow, that made even the impossible seem manageable. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Clara dressed in her most severe teaching clothes. Gray wool dress, hair pulled back ruthlessly, wire-rimmed spectacles she didn't actually need but thought made her look more authoritative. She gathered her lesson materials and walked through the cold dawn toward the schoolhouse. The building sat on the edge of town, a simple one-room structure with windows on 3 sides and a pot-bellied stove in the center. Someone had already started a fire. Samuel Finch, she discovered, who was hovering nervously near the door when she arrived. Miss Bennet, I wanted to speak with you before the children arrive. Clara set down her books and began arranging the desks. Mr. Finch? About yesterday, in church. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. That was most irregular. Yes, it was. Clara didn't slow her preparations. Is there a point to this conversation? The school board met last night. There was discussion about whether your contract should be reviewed. Clara stopped, turned to face him. On what grounds? Well, your behavior, your associations, the concern that you might not be a suitable moral example for impressionable children. Finch looked miserable. Mr. Blackstone was quite vocal about his concerns. I'm sure he was. And what did the board decide? We decided to observe, for now. But Miss Bennet, you must understand that you're on probation. Any further incidents, any more scandals, and we'll have no choice but to terminate your contract. Clara wanted to point out the irony of being on probation for standing up for truth in a church. She wanted to ask if Finch had any moral courage at all, or if he'd sold it all to Blackstone years ago. But she needed this position, needed the access it gave her, the legitimacy. I understand, Mr. Finch. Thank you for the warning. He left, still looking uncomfortable, and Clara finished her preparations. At 8 o'clock precisely, children began to arrive. They came in small groups, shepherded by older siblings or arriving alone if they lived close enough. 23 faces ranging from a tiny 6-year-old girl with pigtails to a lanky 14-year-old boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Clara greeted each one by name. She'd memorized the roster and assigned them seats. She could feel them assessing her, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. The new teacher. The one who'd caused the scandal. The one who sat with the cursed foreman. When everyone was settled, Clara stood at the front of the room and looked at her students. They looked back with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and boredom. Good morning. I'm Miss Bennett, and I'm here to teach you. But before we begin with lessons, I want to make something clear. She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. In this classroom, you will learn to think, not just to memorize facts, but to question them, to examine evidence, to form your own conclusions based on reason and observation. Several of the older students exchanged glances. The 14-year-old Thomas Brennan, according to her roster, raised his hand. Yes, Thomas? My pa says thinking too much is dangerous, says people should know their place. Your father is entitled to his opinion, but I'm curious, how does one think too much? Is there a limit to understanding, a point at which knowledge becomes harmful? Clara kept her voice genuinely curious, not challenging. What do the rest of you think? Silence. The children weren't used to being asked what they thought. They were used to being told. A small hand went up in the second row, the 6-year-old with pigtails. Yes? Clara checked her roster. Sarah? My mama says thinking is like having too much dessert. It makes your brain hurt if you do it too much. Several children giggled. Clara smiled. That's a creative analogy, Sarah, but I'd argue that thinking is more like exercise. It might be uncomfortable at first, but the more you do it, the stronger you become. And unlike dessert, you can never have too much of it. She moved to the chalkboard and wrote a simple math problem. Let's start with something practical. If a rancher has 100 cattle and sells 40 at market, how many does he have left? Hands went up immediately. This they knew. Clara called on a boy in the middle row. 60, ma'am. Correct. Now, harder question. If those 40 cattle sold for $20 each, how much money did the rancher make? More hands, though fewer this time. They worked through the problem together, and Clara made notes about who could multiply quickly and who struggled with the concepts. Then she wrote another problem. The Silver Bell mine employed 200 men before the explosion 3 years ago. 15 men died. What percentage of the workforce was lost? The room went silent. Every child froze. This wasn't just mathematics anymore. This was dangerous territory. Thomas Brennan stood up. My pa says we don't talk about that. Your pa isn't in this classroom, Clara said gently. And we're not gossiping. We're doing mathematics. The explosion happened. 15 men died. Those are facts. We can use facts to learn mathematics without being disrespectful to the dead. In fact, I'd argue that using those facts honors them. It makes their deaths mean something. Thomas sat down slowly, uncertain. The other children watched Clara with new wariness. She'd just stepped over a line, and they all knew it. Clara spent the next 2 hours on safer subjects, geography, reading, basic science. She assessed each child's level and began mentally designing lesson plans that would challenge them without overwhelming them. They were bright, these children. Undereducated and undernourished in some cases, but smart and curious when given the chance. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch. Most had brought food from home, and they scattered to eat in small groups around the schoolyard. Clara sat at her desk and ate her own simple meal, bread and cheese from the boarding house, while watching them through the window. A shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find Thomas Brennan standing there, his lunch forgotten. Miss Bennett, can I ask you something? Of course, Thomas. Why'd you ask about the mine? Everyone knows not to talk about it. Everyone knows it's dangerous. Clara set down her bread and gave the boy her full attention. He was 14, old enough to understand nuance, young enough to still be forming his worldview. Thomas, do you know why it's dangerous to talk about? He shifted uncomfortably. Because Mr. Blackstone says so. And why does Mr. Blackstone say so? Because, Thomas frowned. Because it's disrespectful to the dead? Or because asking questions about what happened might reveal uncomfortable truths? Clara kept her voice neutral, letting him draw his own conclusions. I knew some of those men who died, Thomas. I treated one of them at a field hospital during the war, Jacob Miller. He survived Shiloh but died in that mine, and I think the best way to honor him and the others is to remember them honestly, all of them, including the reasons they died. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. My uncle was one of the 15, Uncle Patrick. I was 11 when it happened. I'm sorry for your loss. Everyone says Mr. Kerrigan killed him, that he was careless with safety. Thomas looked up at Clara with young, confused eyes. But my uncle used to say Mr. Kerrigan was the only foreman who cared about keeping them safe. Used to say Mr. Kerrigan fought with Mr. Blackstone about the conditions. So I don't understand how both things can be true. Clara felt her heart clench. They can't, Thomas. That's the point. Somewhere in those two stories, there's truth and there's lies. The question is which, and whether we have the courage to find out. The boy nodded slowly and went back outside. Clara watched him go, knowing she'd just planted a seed. A dangerous seed, maybe, but necessary. The afternoon passed in reading lessons and history. Clara taught them about the American Revolution, about colonists who'd questioned authority, who'd refused to accept unjust laws, who'd risked everything for principles. She didn't make the parallels explicit, but she didn't have to. The older students understood. When the school day ended and the children scattered toward home, Clara began cleaning up. She was erasing the chalkboard when the door opened again. She turned, expecting a student who'd forgotten something. Henry Blackstone stood in the doorway. Clara's hand tightened on the eraser, but she kept her voice steady. Mr. Blackstone, school hours are over. I know, I came to speak with you privately. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. About your teaching methods. What about them? Using the mine explosion as a mathematics problem? Really, Miss Bennett, that's an extraordinarily poor taste. Blackstone moved deeper into the room, his walking stick tapping against the wooden floor. Those children have families who were affected by that tragedy. You're opening old wounds. I'm teaching mathematics using relevant historical examples. Clara set down the eraser and faced him directly. The explosion happened, pretending it didn't serve no one. And asking what percentage of the workforce died? That's mathematics? Yes. It's also history, science, critical thinking. Clara crossed her arms. Which of those subjects do you object to? Blackstone's smile was cold. I don't object to education, Miss Bennett. I object to propaganda. You're using your position to push a narrative, the narrative that somehow I'm responsible for that tragedy, that Luke Kerrigan is innocent. I haven't mentioned Luke Kerrigan once in my classroom. You don't have to. Your association with him speaks louder than any words. Blackstone moved closer, and Clara fought the urge to step back. You're a smart woman. Too smart to throw away your career on a man who isn't worth it, on a cause you can't win. And if I disagree about what he's worth, then you're a fool. His voice hardened. I gave you a chance, Miss Bennett, a generous contract, protection. All I asked in return was that you be a proper school teacher, not a crusader. But you can't help yourself, can you? You have to push, have to challenge, have to make everything difficult. I'm teaching children to think. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should ask yourself why. Blackstone's hand tightened on his walking stick. For a moment, Clara saw real fury in his face. Not the calculated anger of a man making a point, but genuine rage. Then he controlled it, smoothed it away behind his cultivated exterior. You signed a contract, 3 years, and I will hold you to every word of it. He moved toward the door, then paused. But understand this, Miss Bennett. Contracts can be interpreted many ways, and I'm very good at finding clauses that work in my favor. One misstep, just one, and I'll have legal grounds to terminate you. And then where will you be? No job, no references, no future. I'll be exactly where I was before I came here, free to go somewhere else and start again. Will you? Blackstone smiled. With your reputation? With the reports I'll send ahead of you? There isn't a school district in the West that will touch you. You'll be lucky to find work as a scullery maid. He left, letting the door swing shut behind him. Clara stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, her heart pounding. The threat had been clear: behave or be destroyed. And Blackstone had the power to make good on it. But as Clara gathered her things and prepared to leave, she felt more determined than defeated. Because Blackstone had revealed something important. He was scared. Scared enough to come personally, to threaten directly, to show his hand, which meant she was getting to him. And if she was getting to him after just one day of teaching, what could she accomplish in 3 years? Clara locked the schoolhouse door and walked toward Dr. Mitchell's house. She'd accepted his offer of lodging that morning, and he'd promised to have the rooms ready by evening. As she walked, she passed townspeople who either ignored her or stared with open hostility. She passed the church where she'd challenged a sermon. She passed the hotel where she'd signed away 3 years of her life. And she passed the trail that led out of town toward Canyon Creek Ranch, where a scarred man lived alone with his books and his guilt and his slowly healing shoulder. Tomorrow, Clara decided. Tomorrow she'd ride out there and tell Luke about her first day of teaching, about Thomas Brennan's uncle and Henry Blackstone's threats, and the slow, careful work of planting seeds of doubt in young minds. Tomorrow she'd begin the real work of uncovering truth. But tonight, she'd simply survived her first day. And in a town like Redemption Creek, survival was its own kind of victory. Dr. Mitchell's house sat on a quiet street at the north end of town, a 2-story Victorian with gingerbread trim that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the garden showed signs of neglect, but the structure itself was solid. The doctor met Clara at the door, his medical bag set aside for once, replaced with a ring of keys. "The upper floor has its own entrance around back," he explained, leading her through a side gate. "My late wife used to rent those rooms to traveling nurses. It's been empty since she passed, but I had Mrs. Henderson come in yesterday to clean and air it out." The external staircase led to a small landing and a blue door that opened into what had once been servants' quarters. Clara stepped inside and caught her breath. The space was modest but charming, a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a double bed and wardrobe, and a tiny kitchen area with a pump and small stove. Windows on 2 sides let in the afternoon light, and the walls had been painted a soft cream color that made the rooms feel larger than they were. "It's perfect," Clara said softly. "There's a writing desk in the sitting room," Mitchell said, pointing to a sturdy oak piece beneath one window. "And the bookshelf is empty. I thought you might want to fill it yourself. The rent is $15 a month, which includes firewood and access to the main house if you need to use the larger kitchen or bathing facilities." $15 was more than fair, suspiciously so. Clara turned to face him. "Dr. Mitchell, this is too generous." "It's practical. I need the income and you need lodging. Besides," his expression grew serious, "I meant what I said about helping you. Having you here makes that easier." He pulled a key from his ring and handed it to her. "This opens my study downstairs. You're welcome to use it whenever I'm not seeing patients. The mine records I mentioned are in the filing cabinet marked industrial accidents. They date back 12 years. Clara took the key, feeling its weight. "If Blackstone finds out you're helping me, then he'll find out. I'm tired of being complicit through silence, Miss Bennett. My wife used to say that neutrality in the face of injustice is just cowardice with better manners." Mitchell's voice roughened. "She was right. I've been a coward for 2 years. I'd like to stop now if you'll let me help." "I'd be honored to have your help." Clara extended her hand, and they shook on it, a compact form not in ink but in shared purpose. After Mitchell left, Clara spent the evening settling in. She unpacked her trunk, arranged her books on the shelf, and built a fire in the small fireplace. As darkness fell over Redemption Creek, she stood at her window and watched lights appear in houses across town. Somewhere out there, Luke was probably reading by lamplight in his isolated cabin. Somewhere, Henry Blackstone was plotting his next move. And somewhere, the truth about 15 dead miners lay buried under 3 years of lies. Clara pulled out her journal and began to write, documenting everything she'd learned so far. The names of the dead miners, she'd memorized them from the monument in the town square. The timeline of the explosion. Luke's account of the methane warnings. Thomas Brennan's comment about his uncle. Dr. Mitchell's mention of destroyed safety reports. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a beginning. The next morning, Clara woke early and made her way down to Mitchell's study before breakfast. The filing cabinet marked industrial accidents was exactly where he'd said, tucked in the corner behind his desk. She pulled it open and found folders organized by year and incident type. The Silver Bell mine explosion had its own thick folder. Clara spread the documents across Mitchell's desk and began to read. There were injury reports dating back 5 years before the explosion, minor accidents mostly, but with increasing frequency in the months leading up to the disaster. Broken bones from unstable tunnels, burns from gas flares, respiratory complaints from poor ventilation. Each report was signed by Dr. Mitchell with recommendations for improved safety measures, and stamped across each recommendation was a single word in red ink: denied. Clara's hands trembled as she turned pages. Here was the pattern, clear as daylight. Mitchell had documented the deteriorating conditions. He'd warned of the dangers. And someone, Blackstone, obviously, had rejected every suggestion, every plea for basic safety improvements. But the most damning document was near the bottom of the file. A letter dated 2 weeks before the explosion, written in Luke Kerrigan's neat handwriting and addressed to the territorial mine inspector. It detailed multiple incidents of methane gas accumulation, described the inadequate ventilation system, and formally requested an immediate safety inspection. The letter was calm, professional, and desperate. Clipped to it was a response from the inspector's office, dated 3 days before the explosion. Your concerns have been noted and will be addressed at the next quarterly review. 15 men had died waiting for that quarterly review. Clara copied the letter carefully into her journal, her handwriting shaky with controlled rage. This was evidence, real documented proof that Luke had tried to prevent the tragedy, that he'd followed proper channels, done everything right, and been ignored by a system that valued profits over human life. The question was, why had this evidence never been presented at the investigation? She found her answer in another document, a letter from Blackstone to the territorial governor, dated 1 week after the explosion. In it, Blackstone expressed his deep sorrow over the tragedy and his complete confidence in the official investigation. He also mentioned a generous donation to the governor's re-election campaign, and his hope that the investigation would be concluded swiftly to avoid damaging the territory's mining industry. The implication was clear. The investigation had been bought, the evidence had been suppressed, and Luke had been sacrificed to protect Blackstone's empire. Clara was still absorbing this when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She quickly gathered the documents back into their folder and was just closing the cabinet when Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway. "Find anything useful?" he asked. "Everything useful. Luke's letter to the mine inspector, your safety reports, proof that Blackstone knew about the dangers and ignored them." Clara's voice shook. "Why didn't you present this at the investigation?" Mitchell's face went gray. "I tried. I testified about the safety complaints, showed them my records. But the investigator, a man named Carson, appointed by the governor, ruled that my reports were the opinion of a medical doctor, not a mining expert, that they didn't constitute proof of negligence." "And Luke's letter?" "I never saw it until after the investigation closed. Luke told me he'd written to the inspector, but when I asked to see a copy, he said he'd burned it, said there was no point keeping evidence that no one would look at." Mitchell sat heavily in his chair. "I didn't know he'd kept the inspector's response. He must have hidden it away, not realizing it would be valuable." "How did you get these documents?" "Luke gave them to me a year ago, said if anything happened to him, I should make sure someone saw them. I think he'd given up hope of clearing his name, but he wanted the truth preserved, just in case." Mitchell looked at Clara with haunted eyes. "I've had proof of Blackstone's guilt sitting in that cabinet for a year, and I've done nothing with it. What kind of man does that make me?" "The kind who's been waiting for someone brave enough to use it." Clara sat across from him. "Dr. Mitchell, can I make copies of these documents?" "Of course, but copies won't be enough. Any lawyer worth his salt will claim they're forgeries without the originals." "Then I need the originals. Can Luke get them from wherever he's hidden them?" Mitchell shook his head. "He gave me everything, said he was tired of living with reminders of his failure. These are the originals." Clara thought for a moment. "Then we need to protect them, make multiple copies and hide them in different locations. If Blackstone discovers what we have, he'll destroy them, and possibly us along with them." Mitchell stood, moved to his desk, and pulled out several sheets of blank paper. "I'll help you copy them. But Clara, Miss Bennett, you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about clearing Luke's name anymore. This is about taking down the most powerful man in the territory. That kind of fight destroys people." "I know." Clara picked up a pen. But so does doing nothing. At least this way we're fighting for something that matters. They spent the next 2 hours carefully copying documents. Mitchell's handwriting was precise from years of writing medical notes, and Clara's was clear from her nursing records. By the time they finished, they had 3 complete sets of the most damning evidence: Luke's letter and the inspector's response, Mitchell's safety reports, and Blackstone's denials, and the letter to the governor suggesting a bribe. Mitchell took 1 set to hide in his office at the small clinic he maintained at the edge of town. Clara kept 1 set locked in her trunk upstairs. The 3rd set they sealed in an envelope addressed to the editor of the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, with instructions to mail it if anything happened to either of them. Insurance, Mitchell said grimly. If Blackstone comes after us, at least the truth will get out. Clara taught her second day of school with the weight of those documents pressing on her consciousness. She found herself looking at her students differently now, not just as children to educate, but as the next generation who would inherit whatever world she and others like her built or failed to build. Thomas Brennan sat in the second row, his face serious as he worked through mathematics problems. His uncle Patrick had died because men like Blackstone valued profit over safety. How many more uncles and fathers would die if nothing changed? During lunch, Clara pulled Thomas aside. You said your Uncle Patrick used to talk about Mr. Kerrigan's safety efforts. Do you remember any specific things he mentioned? Thomas thought for a moment. He said Mr. Kerrigan made them stop work twice when he found gas pockets. Said Mr. Kerrigan got in big arguments with Mr. Blackstone about it. Uncle Patrick said Mr. Kerrigan cared more about the men than about the mine. Did your uncle ever write any of this down? Letters, perhaps? He couldn't write much, just his name and a few words. Thomas looked down at his feet. But he talked to Mama about it. She might remember. Do you think your mother would be willing to talk to me? The boy's face clouded. I don't know. Pa says we're not supposed to talk about the mine. Says it's disrespectful to the dead and dangerous for the living. Clara knelt down to be at eye level with the boy. Thomas, I'm not asking you to disobey your father, but I am asking you to think about something. If your Uncle Patrick died because someone was careless with safety, don't you think he'd want people to know the truth? Wouldn't he want to make sure it didn't happen to other men? Yes, ma'am, I think he would. Then maybe you could ask your mother if she'd be willing to talk to me, privately, just to share what she remembers about your uncle. Clara squeezed his shoulder gently. The truth honors the dead, Thomas. Lies are what dishonor them. The boy nodded slowly and went back to eat his lunch. Clara watched him go, knowing she was asking a child to potentially put his family at risk. But she also knew that justice required courage from everyone, not just from those with nothing to lose. That afternoon, after school ended, Clara saddled a horse from the livery. The stable owner had been reluctant to rent to her, but cash spoke louder than scandal, and rode out toward Canyon Creek Ranch. The autumn afternoon was cold but clear, and the ride gave her time to think about what she'd discovered and what it meant. Luke was working in his corral when she arrived, one-handed and awkward as he repaired a section of fence. His shoulder was obviously still bothering him, but he was moving better than he had a week ago. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and froze, watching her approach with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "You're supposed to be resting that shoulder," she called out as she dismounted. "It's been resting for a week. Cattle don't care about healing time." But he set down his tools and walked over to meet her. "What are you doing out here? If anyone sees you, let them see." Clara tied her horse to the corral fence. "I found something. Something important." Luke's expression shifted from concern to wariness. "Clara, Dr. Mitchell has been keeping your documents, the letter you wrote to the mine inspector, the safety reports, all of it." She pulled out her copied pages from her saddlebag. "Luke, this proves everything. Proves you tried to stop the explosion. Proves Blackstone ignored the warnings. Proves the investigation was corrupt." Luke took the papers but didn't look at them. "I know what they prove. I lived it." "Then why haven't you used them? Why haven't you shown people the truth?" "Because truth doesn't matter without power, Clara. I showed those documents to anyone who'd look 3 years ago. Lawyers, journalists, even the territorial governor's office. You know what happened? Nothing. Blackstone had already told his version of events. I was already the villain. Evidence didn't change that. But now it can. Now we have time to build a case, to gather testimony. From who? From the miners who are too scared to speak because Blackstone controls their employment? From the town leaders who are in his pocket? From the territorial officials who took his bribes? Luke's voice was harsh with old frustration. You're tilting at windmills, Clara. Noble windmills, I'll grant you, but windmills nonetheless. Clara felt her temper flare. So you're just going to accept it? Accept being blamed for 15 deaths? Accept exile and isolation and being shot at in the street? I've accepted it for 3 years. Why change now? Because I'm here now. Because Dr. Mitchell is ready to fight. Because there's a 14-year-old boy in my classroom whose uncle died in that mine, and he deserves to know the truth. Clara grabbed Luke's arms, forcing him to look at her. Because you deserve better than this half-life you're living. What I deserve isn't the point. Then what is? Luke was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. The point is keeping you safe. The point is not dragging you down with me. You've already lost your housing, scandalized the town, and put your career at risk. If you push this further, if you go after Blackstone openly, he'll destroy you. He's going to try to destroy me anyway. I saw it in his eyes when he came to the schoolhouse. I'm a threat to him just by existing, just by asking questions. Clara softened her grip but didn't let go. Luke, I'm fighting this battle whether you help me or not. The only question is whether we fight it together or separately. Why? Why does this matter so much to you? It was the question Clara had been asking herself since that first moment in the street when she'd rushed to help a bleeding stranger. Why had she risked everything for a man she didn't know? Why was she still risking everything now? Because during the war, I learned that silence kills just as surely as bullets, she said slowly. I watched men die while officers made mistakes, and no one questioned orders. I saw corruption and incompetence and cowardice dressed up as military necessity, and I promised myself that if I survived, I'd never again stay silent when I could speak, never again stand by when I could act. She released his arms and stepped back. You think I'm doing this for you, but I'm doing it for me. Because I can't look at myself in the mirror if I let injustice stand when I have the power to challenge it. You're just the excuse I needed to finally keep that promise. Luke stared at her, and Clara watched emotions play across his scarred face, surprise, understanding, and something that looked like wonder. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. He reached up, his calloused hand gentle as it cupped her cheek. Clara Bennett, you walked into my life bleeding from a bullet wound, and you've been turning it upside down ever since. Good. It needed turning. She leaned into his touch, letting herself feel the warmth of his palm against her skin. So will you help me? Will you let me fight for you? I'll help you fight, but not for me, for the truth. For those 15 men who died. For every miner who's still working in unsafe conditions because Blackstone values profits over lives. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Clara's breath caught. And maybe, a little bit, for the chance to see Henry Blackstone finally face consequences for his actions. That's all I'm asking. They stood there in the cold afternoon light, his hand on her face and her eyes locked with his. Clara felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of what had been growing since that first day. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about two people who'd been broken by different tragedies finding wholeness in each other's company. Luke seemed to feel it too. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. But Clara didn't want to pull away. She wanted this moment, this connection, this man who'd been called a monster, but who treated her with more gentleness than anyone ever had. His lips met hers softly, tentatively, as if he was afraid she might disappear. Clara kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart beating fast beneath her palms, could taste coffee and possibility on his lips. When they finally pulled apart, Luke was smiling, really smiling, not the cautious half-smiles she'd seen before. The scars on his face crinkled with the expression, and Clara thought she'd never seen anything more beautiful. That was probably a mistake, he said, but he didn't sound like he regretted it. Probably. I seem to be making a lot of those lately. Clara smiled back. Might as well add kissing the cursed foreman to my list of scandals. Kissing the cursed foreman twice, Luke corrected, and kissed her again. This time it was deeper, more certain. Clara let herself sink into it, let herself feel the warmth of his body and the strength of his arms as they came around her. For 3 years, Luke had been alone. For 3 years since Thomas died, Clara had been drifting. Now, in a cold corral at the edge of the Colorado wilderness, they'd both found something worth holding on to. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against Luke's chest. We should probably talk about this. Probably. About what it means. About how complicated it makes everything. Very complicated. His arms tightened around her. But I stopped caring about complications the moment you tore up your petticoat to bandage a man everyone told you to leave in the street. Clara laughed, the sound muffled against his shirt. That was barely 2 weeks ago. How did we get from there to here so fast? Some things don't need time. They just need truth. Luke pulled back enough to look at her face. But Clara, you need to understand what you're getting into, not just with the fight against Blackstone, but with me. I'm not an easy man to love. I've got scars deeper than the ones you can see. I've spent 3 years learning to be alone, and I don't know if I remember how to be with someone. Then we'll learn together. Clara reached up to trace the scars on his face, the twisted skin she'd first seen in the dust of Main Street. These don't frighten me, Luke. They're just proof that you survived something terrible. They're evidence of strength, not weakness. Most people see them as evidence of divine judgment, the mark of a cursed man. Most people are idiots. She kissed the scarred corner of his mouth. I see them as beautiful. Luke closed his eyes, and Clara saw moisture gather in his lashes. You're going to make me believe I deserve this. Deserve you. Good. Because you do. She stepped back reluctantly. But we should be practical. If anyone finds out about this, about us, Blackstone will use it against both of us. He'll use it anyway. The whole town already thinks we're involved. Thinking and knowing are different. Let them think. But we keep the truth private until we're ready to face the consequences. Clara moved to her horse, checking the saddle. In the meantime, we plan. We gather evidence. We find witnesses willing to testify. We build a case so strong that even Blackstone's money and influence can't silence it. Luke nodded slowly. There's a man, Jacob Walsh. He was a miner who worked directly under me. He testified at the investigation but was pressured to change his story. Last I heard, he'd moved to Colorado Springs, got work at a different mine. If we could find him, get him to tell the truth, now that he's out of Blackstone's reach, then we'd have an eyewitness who can corroborate your version of events. Clara's mind was already racing ahead. I could write to him. A letter from a school teacher asking about mining safety practices for educational purposes. Nothing threatening, just an inquiry. That might work. But Clara, even if we get Walsh to talk, even if we have all the evidence in the world, we still need someone with the power to act on it. The territorial governor is in Blackstone's pocket. The local law is useless. Who's going to challenge him? Clara thought about this. Federal law. Mine safety falls under federal jurisdiction if we can prove interstate commerce is involved. The Silver Bell shipped ore to refineries in Wyoming and Kansas, didn't it? It did, but getting federal authorities involved might take time. Might take a lot of documentation and persistence. Good thing I just signed a 3-year contract. Clara mounted her horse, looking down at Luke. We're playing the long game now. Slow, steady, careful. Build the case piece by piece until it's unassailable. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I teach school. You heal and work your ranch. We see each other when we can, carefully, and we wait for Blackstone to make a mistake. Clara gathered her reins. Everyone makes mistakes eventually, even tyrants. Luke caught her horse's bridle, holding her there for one more moment. Clara, thank you for believing in me, for fighting for me, for... He hesitated. For kissing me. The pleasure was entirely mine, Mr. Kerrigan. She leaned down and kissed him once more, quick and sweet. Same time next week? I'll be here. Clara rode back toward town as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She felt lighter than she had in years, despite the weight of what lay ahead. Yes, they were planning to take down one of the most powerful men in Colorado territory. Yes, they were risking everything on a fight they might not win. Yes, the complications were enormous and the dangers were real. But for the first time since Thomas died, Clara felt truly alive. She had a purpose. She had allies. And she had Luke. Scarred, stubborn, beautiful Luke, who'd learned to survive alone but was willing to learn to live together. The evening was cold, and Clara's breath misted in the air as she rode. Winter was coming fast, and with it would come the long months of isolation when travel between town and ranch became difficult. She and Luke would have to be careful, strategic about when and how they met. But they'd manage. They'd survive worse than Colorado winter. As Clara stabled her horse and walked toward Dr. Mitchell's house, she passed groups of people out for evening constitutionals. She felt their stares, heard their whispers. The scandalous schoolteacher out riding alone, probably visiting that cursed foreman again. Shameless, improper, dangerous. Let them whisper. Clara had learned something important during the war. Reputation was just a story people told about you, and stories could be rewritten. Right now, she was the villain of Redemption Creek's story. But stories had a way of changing when new information came to light, when truth emerged from darkness, when the real villains were finally exposed. Dr. Mitchell was waiting for her in his study when she arrived home. "Did you see Luke?" "I did. He's willing to help, and he gave me a lead, a witness who might be willing to testify if we can track him down." Clara hung up her cloak. "Jacob Walsh. Moved to Colorado Springs after the investigation. Do you know how we might find him?" "Walsh, yes, I remember him. Good man. Tried to speak up and was shut down." Mitchell pulled out a ledger. "I keep records of where former patients have gone in case I need to forward medical information. Let me look." He flipped through pages, running his finger down columns of names. "Here. Jacob Walsh, currently employed at the Monument Creek Mine in Colorado Springs. I have an address, boarding house on Tejon Street." Clara copied down the information. "I'll write to him tomorrow, carefully. We can't spook him." "And if he agrees to testify?" "Then we'll have one piece of a very large puzzle. We'll need more witnesses, more documents, more proof that the pattern of negligence was deliberate and widespread." Clara sat in the chair across from Mitchell's desk. "This is going to take time, Doctor. Months, maybe years. Are you prepared for that?" "My wife died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. I called for medicine that was supposed to be in stock at McCready's. It wasn't. Blackstone controlled the supply contracts and had diverted medical shipments to his mining operations because the miners were more valuable to him than the townspeople." Mitchell's voice was flat, emotionless. "I watched my wife die over 3 days because Henry Blackstone decided that treating mining injuries was more profitable than maintaining adequate medical supplies for the town. So yes, Miss Bennett, I'm prepared to spend however long it takes to see that man face justice." Clara felt the weight of that revelation. Blackstone's corruption had tentacles everywhere, touching every aspect of life in Redemption Creek. The mine explosion was just one crime among many. How many other people had suffered because one man valued profit over humanity? "Then we're committed," she said. "All of us. You, me, Luke, and anyone else we can recruit who's tired of living under Blackstone's thumb." "It's a dangerous commitment. He'll fight back. Let him. We'll be ready." That night, Clara sat at her desk and composed a letter to Jacob Walsh. She wrote carefully, presenting herself as a school teacher researching mining safety for an educational curriculum. She asked thoughtful questions about his experience in Colorado mines, about safety protocols and common hazards, and buried in those questions was one that mattered. "I've heard there was a significant explosion at the Silver Bell mine several years ago. As someone who worked in that industry, what do you think could have prevented such a tragedy?" It was subtle, non-threatening. Walsh could answer or not, could say as much or as little as he felt comfortable with, but it opened a door. And that was all Clara needed, a door through which truth might eventually walk. She sealed the letter and set it aside to mail in the morning. Then she pulled out her journal and wrote about the day, about the documents she'd found, about Thomas Brennan's memories of his uncle, about kissing Luke in the cold afternoon light. The kiss probably deserved more reflection, but Clara found herself smiling instead of analyzing. Some things were meant to be felt rather than understood. And what she felt when Luke held her was something that had been missing since Thomas died. The sense that someone saw her completely, scars and stubbornness and all, and valued what they saw. 3 years, she thought, 3 years to build a case, to gather evidence, to slowly turn the tide of public opinion. 3 years of teaching children to question and think critically. 3 years of quiet resistance against a man who'd held this town in his grip for too long. It seemed like an eternity and no time at all. Clara closed her journal and prepared for bed, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept circling back to the documents in her trunk, to the letter waiting to be mailed, to Luke's smile when he'd kissed her. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet, but would, given time and patience and courage. Outside her window, Redemption Creek settled into night. Somewhere in this town, Henry Blackstone was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his power and control. He'd crushed every challenge before, silenced every dissent, bought or intimidated everyone who might oppose him. But he'd never faced someone like Clara Bennett before, someone who'd survived battlefields and loss, and the slow grinding horror of war. Someone who'd learned that the only way to honor the dead was to fight like hell for the living. Blackstone thought he'd contained her with a contract. He thought he'd neutralized the threat through intimidation and social pressure. He thought she was just one woman, alone and powerless in a town he owned. He had no idea what was coming, and by the time he realized his mistake, it would be too late. The seeds had been planted, the evidence had been gathered, the witnesses were being found. The long, slow work of justice had begun, and Clara Bennett, scandalous schoolteacher and battlefield nurse, kissed the cursed foreman Clara Bennett, was just getting started. She finally drifted toward sleep with a smile on her face, thinking of Luke's hands in her hair and the winter ahead and the sweet, slow satisfaction of watching a tyrant fall. Some battles were won with armies and cannons. This one would be won with patience and proof and the relentless accumulation of truth. 3 years. It would be enough. It had to be. Because 15 men were dead, and a good man had been destroyed, and a whole town had been held hostage by fear. 3 years to set it all right. Clara closed her eyes and let sleep take her, dreaming of justice and spring thaws, and the day when Luke Kerrigan could finally walk through Redemption Creek with his head high and his name cleared. That day was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in her heart, in the kiss that still lingered on her lips. That day was coming, and she would make sure of it, no matter what it cost, no matter how long it took. Some things were worth fighting for. Luke was one of them. Truth was another. And Clara Bennett had never learned how to quit once she'd chosen her battle. Blackstone had made his first mistake 3 years ago when he destroyed an innocent man to cover his own crimes. His second mistake was thinking that silence would last forever. And his third and final mistake was underestimating the woman who'd torn up her petticoat to save a stranger's life. That woman was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. And this time, there would be no buying off investigators, no silencing witnesses, no escape from consequences. This time, the truth would win. Clara would make certain of it. Winter came early that year, wrapping Redemption Creek in snow by mid-November. Clara stood at her classroom window one morning, watching flakes drift past the glass while her students worked on mathematics problems. 3 months had passed since that first day of teaching, 3 months of careful maneuvering and quiet investigation. The letter to Jacob Walsh had gone unanswered for 6 weeks before a response finally arrived, cautious, brief, but promising. He remembered the explosion. He remembered being pressured to lie. And he was willing to talk if Clara could guarantee his safety and his job wouldn't be threatened. It was a start, a small start, but more than they'd had before. The classroom door opened, letting in a gust of cold air along with Thomas Brennan. The boy was late, his face red from cold and exertion. "I'm sorry, Miss Bennett. Pa needed help with the fence before I could leave." "Take your seat, Thomas. Copy the problems from the board and work through what you can." Clara watched him settle into his desk, noticing the way his hands shook slightly. Not from cold, from nerves. Something had happened. At lunch, Thomas approached her desk again, glancing around to make sure the other children were outside. "Miss Bennett, I talked to Ma about Uncle Patrick." Clara set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "What did she say?" "She said she'd talk to you, but it has to be secret. Pa can't know, and no one else can know, or Pa might lose his job at Blackstone's lumber mill." Thomas's young face was tight with worry. She scared Miss Bennet, but she said Uncle Patrick would want the truth told, even if it's dangerous. When can I meet with her? Sunday afternoon? Pa goes to play cards at the saloon after church. Ma could meet you at Dr. Mitchell's house. She helps him with laundry sometimes, so no one would think it strange if she was there. Tell your mother I'll be there. And Thomas? Clara touched his shoulder gently. Thank you. This takes courage. From both of you. The boy nodded and went to join his classmates, leaving Clara alone with the weight of what was building. One witness in Colorado Springs, another here in town, willing to risk her husband's livelihood to tell the truth. Dr. Mitchell's documents safely hidden, Luke's testimony waiting to be officially recorded. Piece by piece, the case was taking shape, but so was Blackstone's resistance. McCready's General Store had stopped extending credit to anyone who associated with Clara. The church had made it clear she was welcome to attend, but not to participate in any social activities. Parents had started pulling their children from school for extended family visits that happened to coincide with lessons on critical thinking or historical resistance movements. Clara's class had shrunk from 23 students to 17. And yet, those 17 who remained were learning, really learning. Clara watched Thomas work through a complex word problem, watched Sarah, now 7, read aloud from a book 2 grades above her level, watched the older students debate the ethics of civil disobedience with the passion of future lawyers. Whatever else happened, she'd given these children something Blackstone couldn't take away, the ability to think for themselves. That evening, Clara rode out to Canyon Creek Ranch despite the snow. She'd been making the trip weekly, sometimes more often, using various excuses, checking Luke's shoulder, delivering books he'd requested, discussing the case. The town gossiped, but they'd been gossiping for months. Clara had stopped caring what they thought somewhere around the 3rd time someone had crossed the street to avoid her. Luke had started expecting her visits, and he was waiting by the barn when she arrived, his breath misting in the cold air. He helped her stable her horse, then pulled her close for a kiss that warmed her better than any fire could. "You're half frozen," he said, rubbing her arms. "Come inside." The cabin was warm and bright, a fire crackling in the hearth. Luke had become a better cook over the winter months, partly out of necessity and partly because Clara kept threatening to poison them both with her attempts at frontier cuisine. Tonight, he had venison stew simmering, and the smell made Clara's stomach growl. "I have news," she said, pulling off her gloves and settling into the chair closest to the fire. "Thomas Brennan's mother is willing to talk. Sunday afternoon." Luke ladled stew into bowls, his movements careful. His shoulder had healed well, but it still bothered him in cold weather. "That's dangerous for her. Blackstone finds out she's talking to you." "He won't. We're being careful. And Luke, we need her testimony. She can speak to what her husband told her about the safety conditions, about your efforts to improve them. It corroborates your version of events." "My version." As if there are multiple versions of truth, Luke handed her a bowl and sat across from her. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fooling ourselves, if any of this will matter in the end." Clara had noticed this in him lately, moments of doubt, of weariness. 3 years of exile had taught him not to hope too hard, and undoing that lesson was proving difficult. "It matters because we're making it matter," she said firmly. "Jacob Walsh is willing to testify. Mrs. Brennan is willing to talk. Dr. Mitchell has documentation. That's 3 independent sources, Luke. 3 people saying the same thing despite having no reason to coordinate their stories. That's how truth establishes itself, through consistency across multiple witnesses. And how does truth establish itself against a man who controls the law, the economy, and the territorial government? Through patience, through building a case so strong that even his influence can't suppress it. Clara ate her stew, gathering her thoughts. "I've been researching federal mining regulations. There's a provision that allows the Department of Interior to investigate mines involved in interstate commerce if there's evidence of systematic safety violations resulting in loss of life. The Silver Bell qualifies." Luke looked up sharply. "You're talking about going over Blackstone's head, over the territorial government entirely. I'm talking about taking this to people who don't owe him favors, who don't depend on him for their livelihoods." Clara pulled papers from her bag, copies of federal regulations she'd obtained through careful correspondence. "It's a long shot. Federal investigations take months to authorize, longer to conduct. But it's a path forward that doesn't require us to change the minds of people already in Blackstone's pocket. Luke studied the papers, and Clara watched hope and fear war on his face. Hope that justice might actually be possible. Fear that hoping would only make the inevitable disappointment worse. "If we do this," he said slowly, "if we really pursue a federal investigation, Blackstone will know. He'll come after all of us. He's already coming after us. At least this way we're moving forward instead of just defending." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "Luke, I know you're scared. I am too. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life knowing I could have fought and didn't. Knowing 15 men died and no one was ever held accountable. Knowing a good man spent the rest of his days in exile for crimes he didn't commit. I'm not that good, Clara. You're good enough for me." She squeezed his hand. "And you're worth fighting for, even if you don't believe it yet." Luke stood abruptly, moving to the window. Snow was falling heavier now, coating the world in white silence. "Sometimes I look at you and I can't believe you're real. Can't believe someone like you would look at someone like me and see anything worth saving." Clara rose and went to him, wrapping her arms around him from behind. She rested her cheek against his back, feeling his heart beat through his shirt. "You saved yourself, Luke. You survived 3 years that would have destroyed most men. All I'm doing is helping you get credit for your own strength." He turned in her arms, and his scarred face was vulnerable in the firelight. "I love you. I didn't mean to. Didn't think I had any love left in me after everything. But Clara Bennett, stubborn schoolteacher, impossible woman, I love you." The words hit Clara like a physical force. She'd known this was growing between them, had felt it in every kiss and conversation and shared moment of planning. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that nothing else had. "I love you too," she said, and found she meant it with an intensity that surprised her. This wasn't the gentle, romantic love she'd felt for Thomas. This was fiercer, forged in adversity, and tempered by shared purpose. "I love you, scars and stubbornness and all." Luke kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Clara let herself sink into it. Let herself feel the warmth of his body and the strength of his arms and the miracle of connection after years of loneliness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Tonight. Stay with me." Clara knew what he was asking, knew the implications, the risk to what remained of her reputation, the scandal it would cause if anyone discovered. She also knew she didn't care. "Yes," she said simply. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies with the same patience they'd brought to building their case against Blackstone. Luke traced her scars from the war, the burn on her shoulder from a hot kettle, the long line across her ribs from a fall in a chaotic field hospital. Clara kissed his scars in return, the twisted skin on his face and neck and shoulder, the evidence of survival that he'd been taught to hide. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in Luke's narrow bed, the fire burning low and the snow falling steadily outside. Clara felt more at peace than she had in years. This was right. This man, this fight, this choice to stand for something bigger than her own safety or comfort. "When this is over," Luke said quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, "when Blackstone is held accountable and my name is cleared, if that happens, will you marry me?" Clara propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his face in the dimness. "That's quite a conditional proposal, Mr. Kerrigan. I'm a practical man. Don't want to promise you something I might not be able to deliver. Then let me be impractical for both of us." Clara kissed him softly. "Yes. Whether Blackstone falls or not, whether your name is cleared or not, whether we win this fight or lose it, yes, I'll marry you, because I'm not in love with the possibility of you vindicated. I'm in love with you as you are, right now, scars and exile and all." Luke pulled her back down against his chest, holding her tightly. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." "No," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "There really isn't." Clara rode back to town before dawn, arriving at Dr. Mitchell's house as the sun was just beginning to gray the eastern sky. She was cold and tired and happier than she'd been in years. Mitchell was already awake, making coffee in his kitchen, and he raised an eyebrow when he saw her but said nothing. Some things didn't require discussion. Sunday came cold and clear. Clara attended church. She still went every week, sitting alone in the middle pew while the congregation pretended she didn't exist. Reverend Halloran had stopped preaching directly about pride and rebellion, but his sermons had a way of circling back to obedience and accepting one's place in the natural order. Clara listened with half an ear and spent the other half thinking about Mrs. Brennan's upcoming testimony. After the service, she walked home with Dr. Mitchell, both of them maintaining respectable distance and casual conversation. Anyone watching would see nothing more than a doctor and his tenant discussing the weather. At his house, they went inside separately, Clara through her external entrance, Mitchell through the front door. Mrs. Brennan arrived an hour later, a basket of laundry providing her excuse. She was a thin woman, worn down by hard work and harder circumstances, with Thomas's serious eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, settling her in Mitchell's study with tea. "I know this is difficult. My Patrick's been dead 3 years. Nothing's difficult compared to that." Mrs. Brennan's voice was flat, exhausted. "Thomas says you're trying to prove Mr. Kerrigan didn't cause the explosion. I'm trying to prove what really happened, to make sure the men who died are honored with truth rather than convenient lies." Clara pulled out her journal. "Tell me what your husband said about the mine conditions." Mrs. Brennan talked for over an hour. She spoke of Patrick's growing fear in the weeks before the explosion, his complaints about the smell of gas in the deep tunnels, his admiration for Luke Kerrigan's repeated attempts to shut down unsafe sections. She described how Patrick had come home one night, 2 weeks before he died, and told her that if anything happened to him, she should know it wasn't Kerrigan's fault. "He said Mr. Kerrigan fought like a demon to keep them safe," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice breaking. "Said Kerrigan had threatened to quit if conditions didn't improve, but Blackstone threatened to blacklist him throughout the territory. Patrick said Kerrigan stayed because he thought he could protect the men better from inside than if he left, and Blackstone hired someone who didn't care." Clara wrote it all down, her hand steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. This was exactly what they needed. Testimony that Luke had tried everything, that he'd been caught between impossible choices, that he'd sacrificed his own well-being trying to save lives. "Would you be willing to write this down, to sign a statement?" Clara asked gently. Mrs. Brennan's face went pale. "My husband works for Blackstone. If he found out, I know, and I won't use your testimony unless absolutely necessary, but if it comes to a federal investigation, if we have a chance to actually hold Blackstone accountable, your words could save other men from your husband's fate." Clara reached across the table. "I'm asking you to be brave, Mrs. Brennan, the way Patrick was brave." The woman was silent for a long time, staring at her worn hands. Then she nodded. "Patrick wouldn't want me to stay silent, wouldn't want other wives to lose their husbands the way I lost mine. I'll sign a statement, but it has to be kept secret until you need it." "I promise, Doctor." Mitchell helped Clara draft the statement, and Mrs. Brennan signed it with a shaking hand. They made 3 copies, following the same protocol they'd established before. One hidden in Mitchell's office, one in Clara's trunk, one sealed and addressed to be mailed if anything happened to them. After Mrs. Brennan left, Clara sat in Mitchell's study and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on her shoulders. This woman had just risked everything on Clara's promise that it would matter, that it would lead somewhere, that truth would eventually win. It had to win. Clara wouldn't accept any other outcome. The winter months passed in a blur of teaching and investigation. Clara's class stabilized at 15 students, the ones whose parents either supported her or at least didn't actively oppose her methods. Jacob Walsh sent another letter from Colorado Springs, more detailed this time, describing specific safety violations and Blackstone's angry response when Luke had tried to document them. Dr. Mitchell quietly reached out to other doctors in the territory who'd treated miners, gathering evidence of a pattern of injuries that suggested systematic negligence across all of Blackstone's operations. And Clara wrote letters to the Department of Interior in Washington, letters to federal mining inspectors, letters to territorial representatives who weren't in Blackstone's pocket. Each letter was carefully crafted, professional, backed by documentation. Most went unanswered, Some received polite dismissals, but a few, a precious few, generated interest. In March, as snow began to melt and the creek ran high with runoff, Claire received a letter that changed everything. It was from a federal mining inspector named Robert Morrison, based out of Denver. He'd reviewed her submissions and found them compelling enough to warrant preliminary inquiry. Could she provide additional documentation? Witness statements? A timeline of events? Clara read the letter 3 times, barely daring to believe it. Then she rode through the spring mud to Canyon Creek Ranch and showed it to Luke. He stood in his cabin, holding the letter, and Clara watched emotions flicker across his face. This is really happening. It's starting to happen. We still have a long way to go. But it's possible now. Actually possible. Luke looked up at her, and there were tears in his eyes. Clara, you did this. You made this possible. We did it. All of us. Clara took his hands. But Luke, you need to understand what comes next. If Morrison opens a formal investigation, Blackstone will know. He'll fight back with everything he has. It could get dangerous. Let it get dangerous. I've been living in danger for 3 years. At least now I'm fighting back. Luke pulled her close, kissing her fiercely. At least now I have something to fight for besides just survival. They spent the rest of March compiling documents for Morrison. Clara organized everything chronologically, created summaries of each witness's testimony, drafted a comprehensive timeline of events leading up to the explosion. Dr. Mitchell provided his medical records and expert analysis of the injury patterns. Luke wrote out his own account, page after page of careful detail about the safety concerns he'd raised and the threats he'd received. And then, in early April, they received word that Jacob Walsh was coming to Redemption Creek. He'd been laid off from his Colorado Springs job, mine closures, nothing to do with Blackstone, and was moving back to the area. He was willing to testify publicly now that he had nothing left to lose. It was the break they'd been waiting for, a first-hand witness, willing to go on record, corroborating everything Luke had said. Blackstone found out about Walsh's return within days. Clara knew because suddenly, mysteriously, her school was scheduled for an unexpected inspection by the Territorial Education Board. Parents received anonymous letters suggesting she was teaching inappropriate content. And someone tried to break into Dr. Mitchell's office one night, though they fled when Mitchell surprised them. The pressure was mounting. Blackstone was getting desperate. The confrontation came on a warm afternoon in May. Clara was dismissing school for the day when Henry Blackstone walked into her classroom, followed by Samuel Finch and Reverend Halloran. The children scattered like startled birds, and Clara stood her ground behind her desk. "Gentlemen, school hours are over." "We're aware, Miss Bennett." Blackstone's voice was cold. "We're here to discuss your contract, specifically Clause 12 regarding moral turpitude." Clara's heart sank, but she kept her face neutral. "What about it?" "It has come to our attention that you've been spending nights at Canyon Creek Ranch, unchaperoned, with a man you're not married to." Blackstone smiled without warmth. "That constitutes moral turpitude under any reasonable interpretation. I've been providing medical care to a patient. Dr. Mitchell can confirm." "Dr. Mitchell is hardly a neutral party, given that he's been conspiring with you to slander me." Blackstone's mask of civility cracked slightly. "Did you think I didn't know? That I wouldn't find out about your letters to federal inspectors? Your attempts to resurrect false charges against me?" So he did know. Clara filed that information away for later consideration. "They're not false charges if they're true. They're lies. The same lies Luke Kerrigan has been spreading for 3 years." Blackstone stepped closer, and Clara saw real anger in his face now. "I gave you a chance, Miss Bennett. Multiple chances. I tried to be reasonable, but you've left me no choice. Your contract is terminated effective immediately. You have 1 week to leave Redemption Creek. If you're still here after that, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "On what property?" "I rent from Dr. Mitchell, and last I checked, you don't own his house." "Yet." The threat was clear. "Leave quietly, Miss Bennett. Take your slanders and your lost causes and go somewhere else, or stay and watch everything you care about burn. Your choice." He left, Finch and Halloran trailing behind him like nervous shadows. Clara stood alone in her classroom, surrounded by the books she'd brought, and the lessons she'd taught, and the small victories she'd won. 15 students educated to think critically, one federal investigator interested in the case, multiple witnesses willing to testify. A case built slowly and carefully over 8 months. And now Blackstone was trying to tear it all down. Clara locked up the schoolhouse and walked to Dr. Mitchell's house. He was waiting in his study, his face grave. "I heard. Half the town heard. Blackstone wanted everyone to know he was firing you." "He's scared." "Good. Scared men make mistakes." Clara paced the small room. "But we need to act fast. If I leave town, we lose momentum. If I stay, he'll find a way to have me arrested on some trumped-up charge." "Then we don't give him the chance." Mitchell pulled out a stack of papers. "I sent everything to Morrison 2 days ago. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence we've compiled. I also sent copies to 3 newspapers: Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City. I figured if we were going down, we might as well go down fighting." Clara stared at him. "You did what?" "I took the choice out of Blackstone's hands. The story is already out there, Clara. By the end of the week, editors across 3 territories will have documentation of systematic safety violations resulting in 15 deaths. They'll have witness testimony. They'll have proof of corruption in the territorial investigation." Mitchell smiled grimly. "Henry Blackstone can fire you. He can threaten me. But he can't silence the truth once it's been published. He'll destroy you, your practice, your reputation. My wife died because of his greed. I should have done this 2 years ago." Mitchell stood, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "You gave me the courage to finally act. The least I could do was return the favor." Before Clara could respond, someone pounded on the front door. Mitchell went to answer it, and Clara heard Luke's voice, urgent and loud. "Where's Clara? I heard Blackstone fired her." "I'm here." Clara rushed into the hallway. "Luke, what are you doing in town?" "Coming to find you, coming to make sure you're safe." He pulled her close, not caring that Mitchell could see. "I heard what happened. We need to get you out of town before Blackstone makes good on his threats." "I'm not leaving." "Clara, he'll have you arrested." "Let him try. Dr. Mitchell just released all our evidence to newspapers and federal authorities. The truth is already spreading. Blackstone can't stop it now." Clara pulled back to look at Luke's face. "This is what we've been working toward, the moment when the dam breaks and everything comes flooding out. I'm not running from it." Luke looked to Mitchell, who nodded confirmation. "She's right. The documents are already in transit. By Monday, this will be news throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. Blackstone's time is up. Unless he decides to silence us permanently before the story breaks." Luke's face was grim. "A desperate man is a dangerous man. We need to be somewhere safe until this plays out." He had a point. Blackstone had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence. The shot that had wounded Luke, the attempted break-in at Mitchell's office. With his empire crumbling around him, he might resort to more direct methods. "The ranch," Clara said. "We all go to Canyon Creek Ranch. It's defensible, isolated, and we can see anyone approaching from a mile away. We wait there until Morrison arrives or the newspapers publish." Mitchell hesitated. "I have patients. Who can be treated by the doctor in Colorado Springs for a few days? Your life is worth more than convenience." Clara was already moving, grabbing her essential documents and medical bag. "Pack what you need. We leave within the hour." They traveled in Mitchell's wagon, taking the back trails to avoid being seen. Clara left a note for her remaining students, telling them school was suspended temporarily and they should continue their studies at home. She hated abandoning them, but she wouldn't risk their safety by staying. Canyon Creek Ranch felt like a sanctuary after the tension of town. Luke had been preparing for the possibility of siege. He had supplies stocked, ammunition ready, his rifle cleaned and loaded. Doctor. Mitchell set up a makeshift medical station in case anyone was injured. Clara organized their documents and prepared statements in case Morrison arrived before the newspapers published. They waited. The first day passed in tense silence. The second day brought rain, turning the trails to mud and making travel difficult. On the third day, a rider approached, Thomas Brennan, soaked and exhausted. "Miss Bennett!" The boy practically fell off his horse. "They've arrested Ma!" Clara's blood went cold. "What? On what charges?" "Pa came home early and found your statement in Ma's things. He gave it to Mr. Blackstone, and Blackstone had Deputy Wayne arrest her for conspiracy to slander. They've got her in the jail." Thomas was crying now, 14 years old and terrified. Please, Miss Bennett. You have to help her." Luke and Clara exchanged glances. This was exactly what Blackstone wanted, to draw them out, to force them to act rashly. But they couldn't leave Mrs. Brennan to suffer for their cause. "It's a trap," Luke said quietly. "I know. We're going anyway." Clara turned to Mitchell. "Stay here with Thomas. Keep everything safe. If we're not back by tomorrow morning, send word to Morrison that Blackstone is eliminating witnesses. Clara, you can't. We can, and we will." She checked her own small pistol, a gift from her father during the war, and tucked it into her pocket. "Some things are worth the risk, Doctor. Mrs. Brennan is one of them." The ride back to town took 2 hours in the rain and fading light. Clara and Luke approached carefully, leaving their horses tied outside of town and walking in through the back streets. The jail was a small building next to the sheriff's office, and through the barred window they could see Mrs. Brennan sitting on a cot, her face swollen from crying. "I'll create a distraction at the front," Luke said. "You get her out through the back window."